No, actually, I'm on my way back from. I went to Harrisburg, so it's about an hour away from where I live in
Oh,
Pennsylvania. Yeah, there's actually an interesting art museum there. I saw a show just coming back from it, and yeah, it was a very well done painting series, painting exhibit. It was one artist's show. It was it's really interesting. It was so the subjects were his two children, and it was uh, almost like it was interesting. One was the change of sometimes his technique of brushstroke, where sometimes it was almost like a Flemish, incredibly polished detail rendering of value and color and texture of the children's clothing. Like, and they're doing like they're in the water in the, or they're on a couch, wrapping up in a blanket, or brushing their teeth at the bathroom, um, or sitting in the stairs going to the downstairs basement. Point is like the switching up on that was really interesting. But I think more particularly was the commentary about the exhibit was about the nature of elsewhere. So the idea of like, and I noticed it after I read the summary of the art and went back to see it again, that the artwork being presented, I actually noticed, oh, the commentator was either the curator or the artist himself was arguing or talking about the art was about the fact that the children are in other worlds because they're going through their day doing stuff. But I'm thinking also another time, but wait a minute. But I actually did notice that actually what he means by that is the children, none of the children are looking at the subject. Like no one's looking at the directly at the viewer or the painter as the painter's representation is presenting. They're always looking, either they're sleeping or they're looking elsewhere or they're looking from afar away. It's so I found it very interesting because then you can also see as the elsewhere-ness of the parents in the sense that his dispositional state, looking at his children. Also, I say this because he's the one taking the time to reinterpret the scenes as painted compositions. So I'm thinking about that and chewing on that. I say this because it's on my mind because I was over my parents' house recently last week, and we found some old videos my dad recorded of my family and me growing up. Uh, and it's interesting because at one point, there's my dad's holding the camera and he's like controlling the camera and he's controlling the scene, like what we're seeing. He kind of like fixes on to me, and I'm like 6, maybe 7, and I'm eating potato chips. And I just, my dad's asking, "Oh, what are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, nothing." Oh no, I asked my dad, "What is he doing?" He's like, "Nothing. I'm just looking at you." And I look and I'm chewing my potato chip and I'm looking at him, and I go, "Okay, I love you, Dad." I just say I love. It's just super sweet, uh, and I think it's funny. I'm bringing this up to say, and it definitely cut me up a little bit when I saw the video again because I noticed that I know I go off and I'm doing my own thing. I'd say that I have my moment of engagement with my father, looking at him and the camera as a proxy for it, and then I move on and doing. I'm chewing my potato, just watching TV. I don't know, but then my dad like stays on me for longer than should be the case. It's interesting because I'm chewing and then I'm thinking about it. So now I'm looking at the art piece. I'm thinking about that experience of that art of that video recording, and then I'm thinking because I know that my dad was probably around my age when that recording was done. So I'm thinking about what does it mean to be a parent to have the witnessing of your child have these glimmers of reality presented back to you. Sometimes explicitly, like that straight up, like the child, like a 6-year-old looks at you and says, "I love you" with full sincerity, right? And the other moments of like the child is going through its life and you're still witnessing with almost a reflective back to them how much you love them. Anyways, I'm just chewing about that.
well, that's wonderful. I mean, I'm very taken by this framing of the notion of elsewhere. And it's interesting because I've been thinking a lot, obviously, where the world seems to be on fire constantly and only getting more on fire constantly. There's this kind of tension, and Michelle and I talk about it a lot, with to what degree is paying attention to what's going on in the broader world informed and politically responsible and even responsible as a human being, and to what degree does it start to become very problematic, even almost like a junk food, where there's an enjoyment in everything happening, or what's happening at the White House, or Epstein, or anything, obviously Iran, and there's a certain tension between not caring at all, like acting, no, it doesn't matter, but then also being so much elsewhere that you're not here, right? But but then there's also this elsewhere that children have that seem very endearing, imaginative, creative, and important to the human spirit. Like the children are on the porch making they're making a fort today because it's finally perhaps spring in Virginia. Oh my gosh, please, please. It's like 70. So there's this kind of, they're not on a porch. They're in an adventure. They're in a different place, or if Haven is staring off. There's a certain elsewhere to them that actually seems to be tied to something with the fullness of being, obviously imagination. And Trey had an interesting article comparing the imagination of children as kind of divine, but then the imagination of adults can become fantasy, which can become enclosing, egoic, and problematic. So both of them are in an elsewhere, but there's a different quality in the elsewhere. I guess I'm also thinking about the elsewhere of lack or the elsewhere of beauty, where when you really move to making a generality or a particular tree become definitive, one of one, it has a depth to it that suggests there's a kind of elsewhere embedded and latent in the thing, right? And it's very interesting because it seems as if there's a certain art of elsewhere, like knowing how to do elsewhere well, like where you're actually, say, like we've spoken, once you move from woman to a woman to Michelle, the definitive, there's a depth there. There's an elsewhere there that when you see Michelle or you see any definitive thing or person, it's not merely the surface that you're engaging with. It's also that depth that is here and not here at the same time. So that has a certain elsewhere quality to it. Um, and how if you don't resist, say, the problematic fantasy that Trey is pointing to, or the perpetual emergency of Virilio that constantly has you pulled elsewhere in the world, you seem incapable of being able to experience the elsewhere latent in things, in their kind of depth, in their definitiveness. So there's a kind of art of elsewhere there. And I'm also now thinking about that. I was listening to Michael and Aspasia, and I'll throw it back at you, Mr. Jochen, to speak everything. Although I know you're driving, so please, no worries. Um, Michael and Aspasia were talking about libidinal energy, how libidinal energy, obviously sex, but it also seems to be the same energy of creativity. And, what Aspasia was saying is that what you kind of see in this free sex, and she does this with people with therapy, is one, a sense of a waste of energy, undirected toward depth, and also where sex comes to be used in a way that is a threat to intimacy, where it actually makes people incapable of intimacy. Now, that's not necessarily to say that living X way or Y way is problematic, but what she's pointing out is that most people don't even have a sense that there's a risk to their ability to engage in intimacy in how they act sexually. Like these things are kind of disconnected. And so there's this idea that libidinal energy should be directed toward the intimate, toward the creative, which in this sense is kind of suggesting the libidinal needs to be directed toward the experience of the elsewhere in definitive things, in things that we're experiencing, versus the fantasy elsewhere, right? And a broader category, well, we've talked about it many times. The libidinal for the classic mind is eros, and eros is what creates the becoming of the world. It's unfolding in beauty. So part of the problem is we're completely confused about that. But it's interesting to think as well that the art of elsewhere and what kind of elsewhere we're engaged with and toward also has libidinal consequences. It has energetic consequences. It determines the direction of energy. And then, of course, as you and I have spoken about, if there is something about making Michelle definitive, ergo a partial object, that then creates energy, if elsewhere is not directed toward the definitiveness of a person, then the energy just gets depleted. And that's where perhaps you get all of these people that are anxious all the time, because I think anxiety is tied to a loss of psychic energy, an ability to hold things together. People are anxious all the time with what's happening in the world, but then they're also too anxious to tell to what degree it's good to be informed about what's going on in the world and what's not. And then they're just overwhelmed, and it just speeds up and speeds up, and they feel completely taken away. So I guess also I want to say, I guess I'm just thinking this as you were speaking, and we can talk about anything today, but I find this, just the way you were talking about the notion of elsewhere, really interesting. Um, Part of the issue is that if you're not intentional about your elsewhere is going to be decided for you. You're just going to absorb it. Um, and then, of course, there's the elsewhere when, two people, a married couple, are sitting at the table and one of them's been hurt, and there's just an angry voice going on and on in their head, right? That they don't even know is there. So they're here and not here at the same time. That's a kind of elsewhere that you see people engaged in. And so it's interesting that if you don't develop the virtue, don't develop the attention by which to experience the things around you as partial objects, as definitive and therefore partial, that then draws you in more and more, you're still going to have a relation to elsewhere. It's just going to be an elsewhere of enclosure, an elsewhere that depletes your energy, an elsewhere that pulls you away. And then it kind of eats you alive, actually. I'll throw it back to you, Mr. Jockin, but if you're driving, please don't run over to hit
No,
the
no,
unmute. Great, great.
no, I don't want to get any deer or anything. No, it's all good. Actually, on this note about this is really interesting. This note of the fantasy versus imagination.
Yeah.
I think this is really interesting, especially because under the typical definitions, why is you would think that the fantasy of adult, your note about couples with their sense of like they're here but they're elsewhere hits the note perfectly. It actually and also comes with a kind of dysfunctional intimacy with sex. On this point, you ever notice that when children are imaginary, they want you to play with them in it? They invite up. There's this mode of invitation of unity in the imagination of children. But when adults do it, it's always the absolute hell of aloneness. Isn't that interesting? Because the most devastating thing is when you're in a conflict with an intimate partner, or you're intimate with the person you want to be the most intimate with, yet you feel absolutely disconnected alone. And you're stuck in your own fantasy. You're stuck in the process of fantasy.
Interesting.
Of the images. But those images are meant to isolate you, not to bring people together. That's an instinct that came to my mind, is hearing this distinction. Because that's the point. When children do this imaginational play, they always want you to bring you in. And in fact, that's one of the goals of an adult in terms of like, how does an adult have a relationship of love with their children? I find, again, I'm not an expert in this topic, but I tend to find you play with them. You join them in the imaginary. You get in there, and that fort is a bunch of pillows. Who cares? Yep. It's a real fort, dang it. And we're gonna play together. That's the language that children are gonna remember. I feel like off the cuff instinct about this. So that's why I'm bringing this up. I noticed that. Versus when, actually it's interesting. I found actually from Aristotle, this whole point of like actually to appease the imagination, the fantasy of an adult is to be a flatterer.
Yes.
Because you're denying the truth of the other. You're denying the truth of what appease this person. It's interesting too. That's very different. That's a very different kind of relationship, right? In a sense that I think especially because I definitely being noticed motivation. Because when an adult plays with a child, you're just there to have fun with the child, right? Versus the flatterer is confirming the images, the fantasy images of the person to get usually for a self-motivated good. So basically, the activity of children is an activity of play of the beautiful, dare I say. Because why? It's for its own sake. We play to have fun, to enjoy our company together. Versus the flatterer uses the presentation of the images, the confirmation of it, to basically get some good. Interesting. Again, I'm just chewing on that part. I think that elsewhere-ness is so critical. The elsewhere-ness is another mode of lack. I think it's absolutely the case. Yep. I think 100% the case. because it's and of the symbolic too. Symbol and image
Yeah.
and lack all have a relationship with each other on this exact point, um, because it is always the image is always showing you elsewhere something more. The footsteps show you the presence of the other, right? The change of light in a space is showing the presence of the other. Like you see, like all those are signs of an inference, right? And then when that inference becomes more than just you, it's all it takes is just a one more than a one step inference for then that sign to become a symbol. That's all it takes, because it just means that all it means is just the inferential point is an absence that does not have a direct connection. And then the last note, I'll close on this note. I'm on a mission right now on the sense touch distinction in Aristotle. I'm on a mission. It's basically like I think that's going to be the main theme of my Anima courses on this topic. That and desire and knowledge, which are all connected. So I think those are going to be the big parts, because when intimacy as touch is divorced from image, you get fantasy. You get what I mean by that is, like, you ever notice actually the problem is actually when people have a porn addiction, for example, it's because the oversaturational, there's actually a term for this. Basically, because porn has been super engineered to be hyper arousal by image, but no woman can ever be that. Thus, the guy can't be attracted, as an example.
Yeah.
What's up with that? That's because the actual tangible, concrete person in front of you can never be that image.
Yeah.
That's just one example. But the larger point is that the image is the gratification of image fantasy of the sexual act, which is actually what sex is usually about. Usually, sex, a lot of times, when it's dealing from intimacy, it's about gratification of the fantasy of an image in the subject, the person. Versus intimacy, it's that direct contact, that closeness. And this is why Eros gets misconfused, because we think Eros is about the fantasy image, but it's not that. Not just that. It's a lot more than that, because it's so Eros being divorced from intimacy of touch, of that basically the deepest penetration of the inner and the outer together of Eros is in parallel to the divorce of sublimity from beauty. It's the same move. So as Eros has been destroyed from love by ripping out of intimacy of touch for the image, beauty has the same issue with sublimity. I'll stop with that.
Was really well said. And I'm really taken, well, a lot you were saying was completely on it. And it is very interesting as well how many people, because porn destroys their ability to get aroused, then have to imagine fantasies in their imagination with real people to get aroused. Or those people, it's not an invitation like a child's imagination. The other person in the sex act, usually the woman, is actually having to perform in the fantasy that has been seen online. And it's like this downward spiral that destroys intimacy. And then the irony is, with the loss of intimacy, actually is the loss of sex. People aren't having sex anymore. The unleashing of sex killed it, which speaks to many, many ironies. It is very interesting. So I certainly this distinction between fantasy and imagination that, as Trey was articulating it, I like. And this point also that you're saying about how in imagination the child is inviting you in. So right there's a sort of sense to touch, like to touch, come touch, like sharing in, come share in this thing with me, and also help create it. That's also the key. When the kid says, play with me, they're saying, help me imagine it, help me imagine it with you and make it real. Because there's a sense in which imagination, like if two people both act as if this fort is real, well, then it might as well be real. There's an interesting thing that once more than one person gets involved, it takes on a reality very distinct from the feeling of madness of just making up something, right? And so imagination is sort of an acknowledgement of the need to invite the other person in, so that this isn't just some sort of Lacanian psychotic enclosure, right? It's like working to avoid self-reference. Where the irony about fantasy is it is a self-relation, it is a closed circle, but it doesn't acknowledge itself as such, right? And so then the other person to participate in your fantasy, it's a correspondence theory of truth. They have to mimic it. They have to mimic it, and you decide when that standard is met or not. Whereas in imagination, you together participate in the thing, and neither you nor the child decide what makes it real, because no one has that kind of authority, because it's not a correspondence thing, it's a participatory knowing, to use that Planier language. So it's interesting how fantasy is a correspondence theory of truth. Imagination is a participatory unfolding of the case, and how the child is accepting you in, and bringing you in. And so thus it is social, because it is interesting. Obviously, in Lacan, the symbolic is the social. And there's this idea that the child, the active imagination, is adventing the social in this way, which then is interesting to think, because the imaginary and the symbolic, the imaginary and the social in Lacan has this kind of dual function going together. Aspasia, we're talking about some of the sex stuff that you and Michael were talking about. That was cool. I'm 45 minutes in. That's such a huge topic, Aspasia. So we were just talking about the difference between imagination and fantasy, whereas that Trey talked about, and Trey, fantasy can be the adult, kind of this closed correspondence. Do you meet my fantasy? Where Jochen was making the point with imagination of the child, they invite you in to play with the fort. They want to share in it with you. And it's very interesting to think about the difference between the imagination and the fantasy in this way, and how imagination and the way the child does it can have this kind of inviting in that is a different use of the libidinal, because you and Michael were also talking about the libidinal energy used in the creative act. And Mr. Wing, good to see you, sir. We're talking about sex and all sorts of fun stuff. So, with the libidinal energy, with when it's being wasted, because it's not being directed toward intimacy. So Mr. Jochen was also making the point, as you and Michael were talking about, that when libidinal is directed toward fantasy, then ultimately it threatens intimacy. Whereas when the libidinal in the imagination, no worries, Mr. Wynn, when the libidinal and the imagination go together, that's inviting the other in to participate with you, then actually it can create intimacy. Like when the parent jumps into the fort and gets on in there, as Jochen made this example, right? And so what ends up happening, it seems like a lot of people are stuck in fantasy because they're incapable of imagination. The libidinal is directed toward fantasy, which in this language is self-relation, and kind of it's just an enclosure, whereas in imagination it's sharing. And then it does seem to be the case, and you were bringing this up with Michael, shared energy creates energy. It becomes negentropic. So intimacy creates energy, right? So then if people are having sex but not having intimacy, ironically, they stop having sex. They lose the libidinal energy to even have sex. That stuff goes away, right? That's why people aren't even having sex anymore. And then of course they can't even become sexually aroused because they've had so many fantasies and images online that they've lost that. I'm in the last thing I'll say, and then I'll ask to see. I'd be happy to throw it to you to say anything on anything at all. Not to put you on the spot or anything, but I really, really appreciated what you and Michael were getting at. The last thing that Mr. Jochen was bringing up is the distinction between sense and touch in Aristotle, and how in Aristotle, touch corresponds with reality. Like something you can touch is real. Like it's a unique in that sense of the other senses. Like I can look at something and it'd be a deep fake, but if I touch it, then there's a reality to it. And so I'm now wondering if fantasy is on the side of sense, and Mr. Jochen was pointing to this. If fantasy is on the side of sense, but imagination is on the side of touch, which is interesting to think, because we tend to correspond imagination with that you cannot touch. That is in your head. But really, in an intimate relationship, touch creates imagination. Actually, it creates depth, and then it creates play. And then also, too, the issue is that intimate sex has play to it. Kids are inviting you into play, and if we don't have intimacy, you don't have play, you just have cosplay or something, which is in the side of fantasy and is very problematic. And so it is also interesting to think that imagination corresponds with touch, whereas fantasy corresponds with just sense or sensualization. And yet we tend to think that touch makes things real in the sense of pragmatic or empirical, but really touch stimulates imagination, which makes sense if everything entails a partial object that's ever deeper. But I thought that you asked to see any thoughts on anything.
Yeah, I've got to go and grab something in a second. But I was thinking, as you're talking about that distinction, fantasy as well has something of the I want to use the word trauma, but it's not quite right. Like fantasy is often, it's not trauma, but fantasy is often linked. It seems to come more from a place of it kind of like coming up from your depths, and it's kind of like expressed as a fantasy, whereas imagination for me is much more of an open playground. Like you can go in there, you can purposefully try and think of sorts of things. It's fantasy, like if you really pay attention to people's fantasies and you take them seriously, there's very key information in there about generally to do with attachment and intimacy and all these things. It's so it's more vulnerable in that sense. Like it seems to come from somewhere that is I don't know the language for it. It can carry important information in it, and I think that link to the touch kind of speaks to that as well. There is something of it that is more like a desire for it to turn into reality. Like there is something of it that really is related to a wanting to do in real life. Like if you really pay attention to it in that way. Whereas, yeah, like imagination's a much bigger space. Imagination is, and I agree with you, that's why it's much more likely that people are invited in and that it's a collaborative endeavor. I think fantasy is much more vulnerable in that sense. And, you know, I love this thing around touch. I have to go and grab my breakfast. So I'm gonna do that and I'll be right back. But this is great. I'm glad that you guys enjoyed it. It was a great
Absolutely.
conversation.
Yeah, it's a tremendous topic, and I'll throw it to Mr. Jockin here. Please get your breakfast and don't let us keep you from eating. I'm also now thinking if there's something about the only, you know, because it's interesting. You're right. There is very useful information in fantasy. It can perhaps be linked to why a person is enclosed or why someone is unable to create intimacy. And perhaps there's something about touch that helps you access the information of fantasy in the context of imagination, where in imagination with touch you can get access to that information of fantasy, where in other contexts you cannot. Maybe imagination creates that kind of unveiling dynamic where it makes them comfortable. They feel like they can ease into it or something. I'm not 100% sure. And I was like, yeah, I mean, what y'all were saying about libidinal and creativity, I think it was Napoleon Hill talked about how one of the secrets to many great artists like Oscar Wilde is that they directed the libidinal toward the creative act. But more has to be said on that. But let me throw it to Mr. Jockin here. Mr. Jockin, please.
The bill was being said, two notes. The one thing I wanted to say before, like from where you replied back to me, Daniel, and again, I need to double check this one more time, but basically that there's been no reported cases in medical history that of congenitally blind individuals having schizophrenia. If you lose your sight very young, you can lose your sight. I think even up to like 6 months to a year, like a 6 month to a 1 year old. If you go blind, you're still at risk for schizophrenia. But generally blind, like from the get-go, from the very beginning, no schizophrenia. So the relationship of the phantasm images with schizophrenia, mental illness, that's a very strong. I've seen this discussed in multiple medical journals, and that leads to actually a very important element is that what Aspasia is saying about imagination, with its more that actually has intentional activity at play. That's really interesting because of the relation of memory to this, in the sense that Aristotle's statement about recollection is intentional mental search, like intentional mental. It's usually meant in the sense of like recalling, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. It also means, like, I think when just applying on Aspasia's point about imagination having this much more like intentional kind of activity play, like drawing forth aspect to it. I think I would nap on Aristotle's notion of recollection. I think it's reasonable to say that, as opposed to pure memory, right? Which is much more what Aspasia is saying, because the memories are the reproductions of the phantasm images. That is not voluntary. So I think that's actually, and I agree with your secondary comment, Daniel, that yeah, generally it's about a woundedness. Usually the phantasms in the mode of a fantasy is more about showing an image of a wound. I think that's very fair. And that's really interesting. Again, what's a wound? It's a strike. It's like it's a privational strike contact, of the intimate connection. So it's actually it's like a deep metaphysic psychic loss of the connection that gets processed by a phantasm image at the moment of strike, at the moment of rupture, that then have to get processed later as a rereading of that phantasm image. Just again, just me on that reading of it, but seems like that's what's being discussed here. And I think that's quite interesting, as opposed to, in contrast to the imaginative, which is this participatory act. I agree with you, Daniel, on that, of play, almost I would say a space of geopedia in terms of work with memory. So I'm dreaming about that. I'll pass it off.
It's very quickly too. It's an invitation as well. You know, like fantasy, if you take it seriously, is an invitation to work through something. Like it's an invitation to with another person. Like it's relational. But one has to be. I mean, I think the thing is with fantasy is people prefer to keep all of that very private. So it does. It can speak to needs and desires that were thwarted or wounded, or earlier on in life, and in the way that kind of plays out. And there is an invitation inside it, if you take it seriously, about repair, potential repair around that. But it has to be done again through relationships. So yeah, I think that's key. I am going to grab my breakfast now.
Outstanding. I'm also thinking about, is there something about without imagination and touch that you can't work through the things of fantasy without being destroyed by them or triggered by them, or your nervous system? Like, is there something about imagination that actually gives you the space, gives your nervous system the space, or something like that, by which you can work through your fantasies in a manner that is not too much too soon, in that unveiling Lovecraftian way, with the craft in parentheses. I'm now also taking that point you're saying, Mr. Jockin, on the blind not having schizophrenia, which is fascinating. I've been doing a lot on revisiting Deleuze because I can never escape him, no matter how hard I try. I always find myself coming back around. And obviously, his suggestion is that reality itself has a kind of schizophrenic quality, almost with a capital S, because of all the flows and all the multiplicities, and that the schizophrenic individual is a kind of revelation of the truth of reality that is disowned, that like society kind of disowns it, because that would kind of unveil that really something like capitalism doesn't operate on the individual, but by closing down by closing people into an individuality that is in contrast to the multiplicity that defines reality. He'll talk about the individual instead of the individual, that really people are individuals, but capitalism wouldn't work because it wouldn't be able to function with the commodity form if it didn't close down the multiplicity, the capital S schizophrenia, if you will, like a capital B being or something. If it didn't close it down, then it wouldn't function. So then what that does is set the individual up actually basically to develop mental illness, because what is being defined as mental health is in contrast to what reality is, as this multiplicity and flow and so on and so forth. Now that brings us to the giant question of the relation of Deleuze and Zizek and Lacan and Hegel and all that fun jazz. But there's no need to get into it now, but it's very interesting to suggest that there is something about the lack of touch that defines the modern age that leads to the schizophrenia, to the breakdown of the schizophrenia. And that therefore, perhaps the schizophrenic being a revelation of what the system is kind of holding back, in that it is denying people opportunities of touch because they're always in the phantasms now, in the images, online, and things like that. I'd have to think about that. But I'm also now thinking about how touch, because there's something about the phantasms in the lack of touch, how then the lack of touch increases the likelihood that we fall into recollection versus memory. And then if memory is spirit, as we talked about on a previous net session, that like the memory is spirit, it's the animating principle of human beings, which then of course ties memory with libidinal, that a lack of touch in society also hinders our ability to engage in memory in the proper orientation. So then it's interesting to think as well that a relationship with a lack of touch, that's more prone to phantasms, may not actually be able to recover the memory of it. And if you lose the memory, you lose the history, and the history can be depth, which creates libidinal energy because you have this history with those people. And also the relationship feels more real, and it's something that is shared. That could create intimacy, that creates energy. And also, like, what exactly occurs in the sexual act when people are engaging, like people do, in phantasms or corresponding the sex act with their fantasies, because we were also talking about fantasy having a certain correspondence theory of truth, whereas imagination has a participation theory of truth. And I'll throw it to anyone to say anything. And how part of the problem is that in that state, in sex, people are in a sense not touching. It's interesting to think that there's kind of a lack of touch, and therefore a lack of the creation of memory together, of spirit together, and therefore they're not sharing like a spiritual history. I want to say, if memory and spirit go together, they're not sharing a history in that sense. But I'll throw it to anyone on anything.
I'm thinking too, I don't know, it's messy, but I'm thinking too, as you're talking about touch, there's something too about this thing that I always talk about the kind of having the more like the full emotional experience in one's body, you know, and part of what happens here is that this is another way that they can kind of get arrested. So even like two people having sex, if they're off in their own minds, some like doing something else somewhere else essentially, but they're physically together, I do think that there is a manner in which that's a defense against the emotions about the actual person who is there with them. Like they're kind of, and I just think about when we're talking about touch, there is something as well about just for the individual being able to get fully in touch with their own emotional circuitry, because when you do, like anger is a great example for this one, obviously, you know, when you really do experience it in your body and you just feel it, it goes right into the hands. It's like a heat, it's like an intense feeling running down your arms, into your hands, into your legs, often the jaw, you know, like there's a real, it's a type of touch, like an internal touch, if you will. I do think a lot of that is missed when people are engaging in all these kinds of more mental activities, even when they're trying to be together physically. Right. And I don't know, there's something in that as well. But there is something about the touch that is really important here. There is, I think, too, about the link here too with the emotional stuff I'm talking about, and often what is right underneath, what is thwarting a person's ability to fully access that is a fear of their own power, like a fear of what it actually feels like to be in their body and have that kind of emotional activation. Right. And the closer you are physically to another person, that often is, you know, so it's often the fear of having one's full anger in their body is increased when they are reach out and hug, you know, their wife, right? And they're a man and they're much bigger, because that would be quite a scary state to be in, to be hugging my wife when I also have rage in my hands and I could like crush her to death, essentially. So there's this like, there's, you know, and that's why and this is all unconscious, you know, that's why the anxiety comes on. And but it's the same with sexual feelings, because so often sexual feelings are intermingled with an aggressive drive as well. And so there is something here around that as well, where we're going into imagination, going into fantasy can be a preferential state, if we call it that, as a way to kind of compromise around that. Or keeping, it's keeping fantasy private is really what we're talking about, like as opposed to trying to actually bring it into the reality of a here and now relationship that you can touch and be with. And through that you can actually work through some of it, not always, like we're all going to have, you know, but like there are elements of it that you can actually come to update your understanding of relationship and vulnerability and connection and all these things in yourself, if you take it seriously. But it's a deeply vulnerable thing to do, and I think that's why the sexual feelings, in reality, to be physically that close to another person, again, depending on oftentimes your gender or your size difference or whatever, can be deeply anxiety provoking on all sorts of levels. And then also all the defensive stuff comes on, which is all the stuff like all the cognitive activity that leads us to detach from someone or dismiss someone, or I'm not actually attracted to them, I can think about someone else, and like all this is distancing behavior, ultimately.
Well, what I was going to, I'll throw it to Mr. Jochen here. I think, first off, that connection between touch and in touch is outstanding. I think those are definitely related. And I think also this point you're making about using fantasy because of the fear of fully feeling something or fear of trying to avoid what you feel for the other person in sex. I think all of that is in play. And that also is suggesting that fantasy is being used to avoid being in touch, because that's terrifying, because what could happen, right? What could happen if we go in there? So it is very interesting to think of fantasy as an act of not having courage. Now, of course, it depends on what we mean by fantasy, et cetera, so forth. And again, that distinction Trey's making between imagination and fantasy is just very, very interesting, where in this sense, fantasy has this kind of avoidance structure to it. And then, of course, like you say, there is information in it, because what is in the fantasy Telos bound Trey. He had a wonderful article talking about imagination versus fantasy that I enjoyed, based also on Florensky's some of his work. But anyway, so it's very interesting to think that, like you're saying, people rather be in the fantasy than risk coming into their body, coming into their self, and something happening, and maybe they destroy the person and they kill the person, or they overwhelm the person, or I think also there's a fear of the fullness of energy. Like you were talking about the libidinal, like, oh my gosh, a fully creative, like there are many people who, we see this with children all the time, when people say, children's like, shh, calm down, or like, there's this kind of calming of children. There's this sort of like, don't be so loud, or don't talk so much, or we don't have to do another, calm down. The adult world is defined by this calm down, right? So that too is a kind of like avoiding of the libidinal, avoiding of the life energy, right? And that's also tied to, I think, when you encounter someone or children or situations that are full of life, it kind of calls on you to come into your body and fully feel something. And you're scared to do that. So you tell them to shut up or to calm down, right? And you stay in the fantasy of being a well-kept citizen, or a fantasy of like holding, or stability. I think people can fantasize about stability, or kind of fantasize about nothing. But I'll pause and throw it. But everything you're saying there is fantastic. Let me throw it to Mr. Orient. Yeah, there you go. Let me throw it to Mr. Jochen here. Mr. Jochen.
Yeah, I mean, I think an important, I don't disagree with what Aspasia is saying, especially on the point of, I think the invitation of the phantasms to be processed. I think it's true. It's possible. That's why, to get you to repair, to get you to zero, to get you back to the neutral state, to like a neutral stasis. I think that's fair. I think just to give a qualification, just to kind of put some tension on this, but that's slightly different of discussion than the play of a children's imagination, which gives more energy, right? So instead of an entropy state, of negative state, to zero, versus from a well-being, a stasis state, to well-being, to virtue, eudaimonia, things like that. I think I'm not disagreeing that they are definitely connected. This is why health is so important. Obviously, you gotta not be sick so that you can be healthy, but but the absence of pain does not, or absence of illness does not make one healthy necessarily. You could just be in a neutral state. I think that's a lot of tension people have. I say this in a sense that, well, as long as I don't feel pain, or the numbers say I'm healthy, I am healthy. That's the reason why I'm bringing this up. Is because actually people hide behind either the absence of pain or the images of statistical data or representational images that tell them that they're healthy, as opposed to the living activity of being healthy, right? Just that's why this is so subtle but very important. Again, it's not to discredit or just challenge that original premise of like, can the working of the phantasms prepare the relationship and via the social relationship of discourse? Yes, it's possible. I don't disagree with that. But I think the tension I have is does that create the negentropy energy of the kind of discussion we're having about imagination? That's the question I have. I think it's possible. I think actually maybe the motion movement from it like from a discussion of phantasms to imagine, like from starting there and then going into the imaginary. I think it's definitely possible. I know from personal experience from therapy treatment I've been in, that's happened. Like language was used. I was using certain language. That language was interrogated, and there's actually images with that language. I was using very metaphoric language. And then my therapist was like, you know what? He actually played out with me. It was a courtroom. It was like guilt, the image of the courtroom. And he was like, all right, let's play. And he started talking through the positionality of the judge, of the jurists, prosecution. Like he did the whole thing with me. And actually, that did actually release me from that image, from the capture of that phantasm of guilt. So I'm bringing it up to say, I think that it wasn't just about discoursing about the phantasm. It took an imaginative activity play with that image to break it, to finally release it. So that wasn't to not just repair, but to reorient kind of allow me to move on my life. So the repair occurred from doing that and allowed to build new relationships and move on my life. So that's just the part I'm chewing about with that at the moment. But it's not to disagree. It's just to say I just want to kind of see how the two parts relate with each other and talk through that. I think actually another note, by the way, and from Dianima with Aristotle, he actually says what emotion is logos in mattered. So when the logos is put in body is in matter, that is what emotion is. I think that's actually just really important. So that part right there says, so that's when we talk, and anger is actually the emotion Aristotle uses in Dianima to talk about this point. The emotion of anger is an account revealed in the body, right? So I think this is very much, on point. And I think a big note is that, yeah, I agree that people do not want to contact those emotions. They don't want to address the account. They don't want to address it. And it's also interesting we use that language of distance, the distance aspect of relationship, right? We use psychological distance to try to break contact. So this idea of touch with the psychic and the spiritual and the soul and the mental it's very interesting. A concept of touch with distance that is of the material corporeal is also being used intelligibly in this way with speech, with emotion and intimacy and relationship. I find that very interesting. Also, last note, and this is why I'm going down this route of sight, like the sense, basically the contrast, or apparently like the double move of sight with touch, is because, listen, in metaphysics, Aristotle comments that it's by sight that we have our power of knowledge, right? And there's this language of noetic sight, with light and all the other discussion related to vision, noetic vision, I already know. We desire to see. Actually, the Greek for metaphysics, the beginning of it is not just we desire to know, we desire to see. That's what's really important. The Greek used for to know is the knowing of sight. We want to witness. We desire to witness. But I knew about that. But now the kind of whiplash moment from Dianima is Aristotle says point blank, oh, by the way, why are the humans the way they are, the best of the intellect? Like, why are they the best? It's because our power of discernment by touch is the best. Very bizarre. It's like, what? And he means touch discernment. He's not even saying like, oh no, that's like mental discernment of sight. No, he means he's talking about touch, about this. Our power of touch our power of touch is the greatest power of discernment of all creatures, of all creation. It's crazy. So it's like, whoa, what is Aristotle doing with this sense of touch, of the haptic of touch? What is he meaning by that? I'm chewing on this. So how to bridge and then how do they get connected is we see this notion of distance of the emotive, of the psychic, of the relational, is also pointing out there's something going on. It's a bridge almost between the two concepts or the two notion aspects of it. I'm chewing on that. So I have.
I'm thinking too, though, there's something about it is the content of the fantasy often then that is the thing that leads to the distancing, right? Like it's the working through. I'm with you. I think that the working through of material that is in the fantasy, though, is often incredibly painful, and which is what you're saying, I know. It's often very painful, and it then can lead to, if you do it, it can then lead to a place where it opens up more possibility. It's a growth in that way, if you will. But it's definitely one of those experiences that's more like walking through fire. Like it's not an easy, simple task. But it's often about coming up against our limits, like I think about like fantasy around, the desire for the omnipotent other and all these sorts of things, that to really confront that you're never going to have that, that no one can ever be that. That when confronted in the right way is the thing that then unlocks a lot of emotional experience about that has been trapped, and is incredibly painful and can be guilty and all these things. But it's almost like a blockade. It's like until you do that, then you don't actually have a broader realm of imagination and sort of possibility ahead of you to play with. But I agree. The touch thing here, I know I'm talking about emotions in the body and emotional circuitry, but I talk about that because that's often the thing that just naturally then leads to a lot of spontaneous imagery. Imagery is definitely tied up in all of this. And a playfulness. There is a natural way that people come to be able to work with the images that arise and the feelings in their body that is more imaginative in that sense. And that's a bit that's required almost for the working through. I think that's what we're talking about here. You do go into much more of a playful, imaginative space for the working through, but to get there, you have to be in you have to really bring the fantasy up. Anyway.
No, I think that's very well put. And Mr. Luber, good to see you. And Michael, we're talking about your talk with Aspasia on sex and libidinal and stuff like that. I'm an hour in. I really like it. So you're talking about a lot of important stuff. So I'm very taken by what you're saying. So there does seem to be something about, unless you go into the fantasy and find the pain there or what's being held back, you can't enter into imagination that has this geopathic feel to it. And because the notion is that there's something in fantasy that means there's something in fantasy that needs to be brought to the surface. And it's almost like if it is not, there's a repression there. There's something that can't be released. I'm now thinking of that in light of, I'm always trying to deal with the relationship between Deleuze and Lacan and lack and multiplicity and all of that, and trying to see how these things go together. And to me, what Deleuze basically says is, all right, come on, guys. There's no lack in kids. They're playing around. They're making connections. They're experimental. This notion of some sort of ontological lack seems kind of ridiculous when you look at kids, right? But then when you get to Lacan and psychoanalysis like that, they're like that human beings seem to be defined by this kind of lack, right? So how do we parse these tensions, right? Well, one of the things that I like to say is that, yes, kids start off basically imaginative. Lack emerges from hurt in the social. The other hurts you. Then you, in that, are forced to acknowledge the other is real, that they actually have reality. Thus, it develops lack. But the name of the game is to actually get back to the play of the child, to actually go through the lack and to get back to it, right? And so it's kind of Deleuze, Lacan, and then kind of a return to Deleuze in this kind of playful, imaginative, and then that would also bring to the beautiful, right? So there's also this sense that perhaps it's children start in imagination, and then it is inevitable we get hurt, or then in that hurt, we're tempted to just go to fantasy and kind of go into fantasy, and that's where we can end up forever. But if you can actually do the work of facing fantasy, you can come back out into imagination. And you could argue it's a sublated higher imagination than the child, because it's actually done the work of going through the fantasy. In the same way that I always talk about cheap Deleuze, if you don't go through the lack, you get this cheap Deleuzianism that destroys the social order. But if you go through it, you can actually get kind of a meaningful Deleuzianism that is informed by the psychoanalytical. And, that. So similarly, it seems as if and I think you see this, like you see the adults who are able, like, think about the people who are adults who are playful. When you speak to them, there's jokes, you're having fun, it's playful, you could be there for hours. Like those kind of adults capable of that, I will go on a limb and say that they've done the work of they've done work to go into fantasy, to feel, to be in touch with themselves, that enables them to return to imagination and play, and to actually, as adults, be able to do that. And you could say that what characterizes the adults who are able to not take themselves too seriously? Like, you meet those adults, they're aware, those people that don't take themselves too seriously. I would say they've gone and found the information in fantasy, and they've worked it through, right? And the couples that are able to engage and play in this way have gone into the work of fantasy, and they're not using fantasy to escape the imaginative field of one another. And in this sense, you could say, and then I'll give it to Michael here, that basically, if the libidinal energy does not libidinal energy is wasted if we don't do the work of fantasy, in this sense of bringing out the trauma that it's hiding. Like, the libidinal energy just gets stuck there, and that's why it goes toward the fantasy, because it's actually coping with the pain. Like, what is it? Your libidinal energy is actually being used to cope with and to conceal yourself from the thing you are not facing, or the truth of yourself, or something, right? So all of the imaginative and libidinal energy goes in the direction of a kind of self-support versus creativity with the wider world, with other people, right? So if the libidinal doesn't return to the imagination, it doesn't go into the social. Because a point, Michael, that Joachim was bringing up is, when kids are in imagination, they invite you into the fort. Like, imagination is like invitational, right? Like, come on and let's do participatory knowing. And a point we were saying is that fantasy is more like, I have a fantasy and I'm going to make reality correspond with it. So a correspondence theory of truth, and it's much more egoic, right? But then Aspasia was making the point that's very true, that there is valuable information in the fantasy, right? Because the question becomes, why does a person become egoic? Why do they do that, right? So then there's the idea that you have to go into the fantasy to bring out that truth, or else they're not going to be able to release themselves, in a sense, back into the imaginative, back into the other, back into the social. Right. And so I think that is very true. And there's a sense then where, if the work of the fantasy is not carried with and taken on, the libidinal energy is simply going to be in service of the preservation of the ego, as opposed to creating a new social field. And I think most libidinal energy in this planet does get used in service of the preservation of the ego. But here's the funny thing: energy that is self-relating is entropic. So it runs out, where energy that relates with the other is negentropic. Right? So unless energy, libidinal, returns through pain and imagination back in fantasy, back into imagination, it'll just waste itself. It will be entropic. It will not be negentropic, right? So the work of facing the fantasy becomes extremely important. I have more notes, and I am thinking more and more about this touch matter, which the relation of touch. Well, like, people don't, like, it's very interesting. A characteristic of adults who don't touch are ones who are stuck in fantasy, who haven't faced the fantasy. Like, it is interesting how people who are playful or in imagination, they're okay with high fives and like hugs, but notice the lack of touch in adult lives that have not faced their fantasy, because touch is a reminder of the otherness out there that your libidinal energy is being used in service of keeping you from. So you don't want to touch the world, because that makes it real and it's too painful, as Aspasia was saying. And it becomes a testament to a misused libidinal. But let me throw it to Michael here. Michael, please.
Yeah, this is all really great. Speaking of adults and babies, my sister is babysitting our neighbor's baby next door. So maybe I'll try and keep the libidinal sex terms to a minimum, as to not. She's teaching him about piano and very enlightening things, and I don't want to corrupt his mind forever. But no, this is really great stuff. I was kind of just seeing parallels between my conversation with you, Aspasia, and my conversation with Daniel and Michelle yesterday. And we were talking about marriage, and kind of this this idea that, when two people join in this union of marriage, they're building this third thing that kind of extends beyond the two people, right? It's not just me and you, and we come together. It's like there's a new horizon that's being built, and how that in my life, the people that I've observed that have really done that really do seem to have this have done this work around sublating the libidinal, right? And you know, something Aspasia and I were talking about is like the libidinal is ultimately this creative energy, right? And so it's not just reducible to sex. It's, you know, it's and often the inability to recognize that and recognize that that energy can be used for things other than that. And maybe a signal to create a work of art or to, you know, to have that conversation, you know, to have that conversation with your partner, or to, you know, exercise, or you know, go on an adventure or something like that. That seems to be really important. And it seems like I don't know if we've ever had like that education. I don't know if we've ever had that communicated, that like, oh, like there's this energy, and you know, it seems like people are pretty good at recognizing like when they have a sexual urge, right? But it doesn't seem like we're by and large very discerning in how to go about, like, you know, expressing that or whatever. So yeah, that's very interesting to think about. And the other thing about fantasy, yeah, I agree with both Jockin and Aspasia, and it's interesting to kind of have both of those realities be true at the same time. I'm writing this paper right now on parental narcissism and its effects on adult children, and like pathways for healing. And I was just thinking, as both of you were talking, that in a narcissistic family, it seems like the narcissistic parent kind of has like a monopoly on fantasy. Like they get to play out their fantasies of control, of manipulation, of you know, this power hierarchy, and no one else, critically, like no one else gets to explore their fantasies in that environment. Like it's everything is oriented towards, you know, sustaining that pseudo homeostasis of dad's in charge, mom's in charge, whatever. And you know, speaking from personal experience, being in that environment as a child, you have like pretty violent fantasies of, you know, yeah, pretty violent stuff towards your parents, you know? And so the inability to act that out leads to emotional suppression. It leads to kind of a neutering. It leads to a fear of your own fantasy. And so then you're subject to, you know, social scripts of performative goodness, right? Whether that be from your family, whether that be from peer groups, whether that be from larger, you know, society at large. Because fantasies, like acting out fantasies, have the potential to destroy a marriage, to lead to yeah, like social unease. And it seems like throughout world history, fantasies that aren't channeled towards like ultimate relationality and like some sacredness kind of lead to violence, right? But there's critically this message, and you know, Freud and Jung say a lot, you know, talk a lot about this when they talk about the unconscious, of the communication that fantasies have by way of suppressed emotions, you know, desires, and it seems like acting them out is this kind of libidinal thing of birthing a new possibility into being, and having that in service of and contacted by someone else's fantasy, as opposed to just, it's my fantasy, I'm going to bend the world to kind of conform to that, seems like the necessary constraints. We were also talking about constraints, Daniel, and how that actually affords more creativity. But yeah, those are just some thoughts. Pass it back.
No, magnificent, and always good to see you, Mr. Wynn. And I'm taken as well, and I'll throw it to Jochen here on this idea that fantasies you do not address, you will play out subconsciously without even realizing it, and that also the parents taking on power parents taking on power in a family can also be kind of a way to get back power that they feel like they were denied when they were growing up, and then their kids are basically sacrificed in order to make them kind of deal with that trauma and different things. I think I'm also very interested by the difference between maybe the difference between examining a fantasy to see like the egoic truth that is there versus the just playing out a fantasy. Because like you're saying, there seems to be this major danger on just playing out fantasy, right? Like where you just play it out because you're playing it out, you're not examining it to get the egoic truth, right? You're not actually using it to face yourself. You're actually using the playing out of the fantasy to avoid yourself in that respect, right? And actually then saying everyone else ought to let you play out your fantasy. And so it becomes a kind of totalitarianism, becomes a kind of power move, right? Because if you don't let me play out my fantasy, then I'm denying my fantasy, and that's repression. But what's very interesting here is, I think, a suggestion, and Daniel, good to see you, sir. What's interesting here is there's a suggestion that playing out the fantasy can actually be the repression of the fantasy, because you're doing that to avoid examining the fantasy. And what we've done is conflated playing the fantasy out. Maybe that's the ultimate self-deception, right? Where you convince yourself that playing out the fantasy is overcoming the repression, when that's precisely to make it super repressed, because you're not actually examining what is egoic that is being concealed. So that kind of triumph of the therapeutic in that Philip Reeve sense is an ultimate damnation, precisely because it seems to be the ending of the repression when actually it's its supreme accomplishment. That is very interesting to think. And I definitely think there are many couples that let one another play out their fantasies as opposed to getting to the egoic root in the fantasy to open up a field of imagination. And that is the work of intimacy. That then creates energy and so on and so forth. So that's extremely interesting, but I will pause, throw it to Mr. Jochen and then Mr. Luber. Mr. Jochen, please.
There you go. Okay. Hi, everybody. I got home, so I switched over to my lab.
Fantastic.
Okay. I think what Michael's saying, I think is absolutely spot on. I think it's really interesting what he's saying, because I think the one is absolutely the nature of the imposition of a fantasy that others have to live by, right? Versus participating in it together. I think that's actually a really important detail, because I think it's just that there's something about that gives that it allows. You said before, Daniel, you were speaking about how there's a kind of energy that's created by more than one person participating in the work together, in the imaginary together. There's something about that creates a feedback mechanism. I think that language of feedback is very important. Feedback is getting something back, right? So there's an echo, there's a reception, so a return. So I think about that when you don't have the feedback, and that's the thing, is not in a sense of self-confirmation, right? This idea of mimetic correspondence of just self-confirmation of what you desire, right? Versus, I think I should make note, by the way, surprise. I think I should make distinction. I think the surprise is one of those heuristics that picks this up pretty quickly. Basically, you don't want surprise. You definitely do not want that. If you just want to confirm your fantasy, no. Versus the surprise, like, oh, that's a really you're having a fun interaction or play, and then it's like basically improving, right? Where someone does something surprising and then adds to the interaction, and then we just go with it, and then we have more fun with this, and more activity comes from that. I think that really stands out. It's very different than, again, a narcissistic dynamics, where narcissism is meant to be. I mean, remember the image of the narcissist. It's a mirror. It's self-image desire. I want to be shown how great I am by desire of the image in the mirror. I think in water, right, reflected back, but it's basically the idea of reflectivity. By a thing that actually cannot give you that. I think that's generally the big problem. The big problem is then when the imposition of the fantasy is put onto something to try to be the replication, reflexive replication, but it's not that by definition. It can't be. It's not, because the son is not the parent. Like, as an example, the daughter is not the parent. Like, they're different people. But usually an example is when a parent puts a fantasy image posed onto that child to be a certain way, right? To be a certain kind of person, right? That's inherently going to be a problem. Let's just imagine that's very different than, again, the imaginary is this absence that has an interplay of elsewhere, the elsewhere-ness of play, where we work, that we kind of have an activity of surprise, and we're generating in the imaginary that something that is not there, it becomes there by the interplay done together, and that creates energy, basically eupatia, energy, activity, and reveals something new along the way. I think those are really interesting details. I'm just chewing on that a lot. All right, that's what I got.
No, outstanding. And I'm also taken, and I'll throw it to Mr. Luber here and anyone else who wants to speak on this fine evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be. Everyone, have you seen our fairy lights now? Grace loves these fairy lights. Oh my gosh, we put those up. You see those little lights? Oh, Grace is all over it. The closeout aisle at Sam's is amazing. No more fluorescent lights. We have like an open mic garage now with carpets and everything. Thrown away. If people are throwing away carpets, get them and put them in your garage. It makes it like an auxiliary building. It's really fun. Anyway, what you're just saying about it was interesting because you were speaking earlier about this kind of, in Plato, Aristotle, this longing to see something, not to abstractly know it, but a certain seeing something, which of course speaks to beauty. Like, we don't just want to know beauty, we want to experience, we want to see something. So the end of kind of the work of we could say the mind or philosophy is a certain seeing, a certain experience. It's very interesting to think in replication in the Narsicaa. It's like you're seeing yourself as the form. You're seeing yourself as the beautiful. What you're doing when you seek replication or the egoic is like, there's the beautiful. I see it. I don't just abstractly know I'm awesome. I make another person into it and see it. So what you're doing is, Mr. Jockin, please.
There's one note to add on that. I actually remember Lacan has a whole section called the mirror phase. So, Hobbit, here he talks about this, where the infant sees a mirror image of themselves, and by that ecstatic image, they get the I function, to use the language of Lacan, of the ego self gets generated. But I function is separate from ego. But anyways, the first definition of distinction of the self gets made by the image of the mirror image reflection. So I just want to share that note.
Well, and I would say what ends up happening is many adults, because they don't face their fantasies and they get stuck in a mirror stage, they never get beyond it. For Hegel, that means they're stuck in self-consciousness. They never move to reason, where they identify otherness as real. And so what ends up happening is we spend out our entire life basically we have the recollection of that ecstasy of the formation of the ego from the mirror states that we're trying to replicate, as opposed to sublate it to a higher form that would require well-facing fantasy and being opened up to the imaginative field of the other, where the geopathic is possible. So I think we basically get captured by that stage of development and reified forever and ever. But I think that's getting at a lot. And I think, indeed, what ends up happening is the correspondence theory of truth is the ultimate narcissism, and where we basically are then the standard of truth, and we spend our life trying to correspond reality to us and seeing evidence of that. And I guess the point also as well, I'll give it to Mr. Luber and then Aspasia, and then basically to the degree that we fail to do the work of facing our fantasies is to the degree that we will do that even if we know we shouldn't or say we shouldn't, because you're going to kind of almost be, you can't even have freedom. You're just going to be a slave of that egoic dimension that you're not facing. But I will pause and throw it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, I hope you're doing well on this fine day, sir.
I'm doing well. Good to be here. Thank you for having me. I liked your question. I want to start with the question you were posing before, after Michael, before Jockin, where the different perspectives of basically analyzing the fantasy versus actually trying to confront your fantasy. Because in a certain sense, there's a strong overlap between the two, where like by virtue of being able to analyze a fantasy means that you're seeing and resonating with a certain logic that is the same logic that is at play when actually confronting the fantasy. So in a certain sense, like someone that can, and I'm just going to use like a movie analogy, like someone that can like really analyze a movie doesn't necessarily have the juice, so to speak, to make a movie or like actually make a story. But I would say to be able to act a movie, the creative endeavor in that act shows that there's the capacity to actually make your own movie as well. So to me, the question is about the logic is the same in both. So it's not a question about logic. It's a question of why does one stop after analyzing? Like, why does someone stop and not actually take that leap into the creative act to continue with that analogy? And I think there's a couple reasons for that, but an important one to highlight is the feeling that you're alone. Like to that point about, like, I forget who said it. Forgive me, I'm like walking, so it's hard to keep track sometimes. But like someone was just saying how basically you can't, like the analogy that came in my mind was like, yeah, you can't actually write alone. You need the bounce board. You need the other. You have to like kind of get that note that penetrates through what you're writing in order for you to kind of like get destroyed for a second, then to come out with like a better product. And that's why like you kind of need to have someone to work with or people to work with. But I think the reason why people don't do that creative act, to stick with this analogy, is the sense that they're actually alone. Because if you are with other people, there's almost like a gravitational pull of when you're doing the creative act, they simultaneously are also doing the creative act. Like it's not something that like you have to will them to do. And the fact that you're able to like will some kind of creation gives credence to there being some kind of like communal will behind that that's actually doing that simultaneously, at least in my experience. And I'm like definitely not a normal case in terms like I got like 3 partners in LA. Like I'm very much like psychotically sharing my ideas. So like it's not normal in a certain sense. But you know, if you try to like really map it onto reality, it's like, well, what's like the most creative act in a certain sense? Making love and having kids. How do you do that? Well, you can't do that by yourself. You're going to need someone else. And even when you have kids, it's like, well, you have grandparents and they're there and there's a role with them too. And there's a dynamic with them too. And oh, wait, it's not even just your family, but you got friends and they might also play a role in helping and et cetera. Like there's all these connections that emerge in the creative act that it's just not by yourself. And I really think a lot of people, you get this feeling of I can analyze because it's almost like an internal dialogue in a certain sense. But when it comes to the creative act, they're just alone. The feeling of being alone and like, who's going to help me? How, like that unconscious need for a bounce board, essentially. And yeah, I just think in reality, when you're analyzing something, it's inherently not alone because you're analyzing the other. You're analyzing how the fantasy realizes the other. Like that is the analysis in a certain sense. Like you're the realization of like how the fantasy and how the fantasy relates to some big other is essentially the journey in every story. Like the resolution is always some kind of mediation of how the fantasy actually relates to the other. And there's always a kind of, you know, stance that's inherently related to it in order to even have access to that. It's always a positive, it's always a positive or negative stance, and comedy or tragedy. And yeah, so I think when it comes down to it, you're really never by yourself. And the only reason that stops the creative act is this sense of loneliness, or like that you have to do it all by yourself. And kind of going back to what I said a couple of nets ago, where it's like you're not going to really feel like you have an opportunity in life if you're just by yourself. Like, a lot of people are like, oh, fuck the AI and the jobs, and humans are being replaced. But it's like, really, it's like an opportunity thing. You feel like you don't have an opportunity in life. And like, if you have like some kind of group, there's always a hope, there's always an opportunity on the horizon. There's always something that strings you along if you're with other people. Because like, what's bringing you together? With what's actually bringing everyone together? It's a certain activity that has hope baked into it. You know, it's like, oh, well, if I keep coming to the net and I keep talking and I keep ruminating, maybe ruminating is not the best word, but keep circling these ideas, that something new can emerge. Like, the hope here is that there's something new that's going to emerge, that's going to give that anxious feeling. Maybe anxious, I think anxious is actually the right word. There's an angst of there's something that I'm kind of tasting, I'm scratching at, but I can't get there alone. And there seems to be other people also scratching at it, that if I keep talking with them, something's going to happen. Like, some thought is going to come to me that will be new, and I can actually take an action with confidence behind it. And courage and all that shit has to do with it. But I think I made my point. I'll pass it off.
No, outstanding. I think that feeling you're describing gets tied to intimacy as well, right? And there's also something where when you feel like you have that scratch with someone, that can create a certain intimacy. And there's also something about imagination that is tied into that. When you jump on the net, it's like the kids saying, jump in the fort and play and play and play and see what happens, and you get taken up. I'm actually taken by, I'll throw it right to Aspasia here. Like, as you were speaking, I was also having that image of, we had this thing at the local library where a bunch of families come and you build forts. And then these people come around trying to destroy the forts, and there's a bunch of cardboard boxes. So, the kids and I were building forts. And it's funny how if you say, yes, I'll go, then boom, you're in the world of building forts, right? But it's very easy to say, no, that's a waste of time, or that's silly, right? How if you say yes to the otherness, then it can kind of have this pull along, this kind of energy and life, and you're outside yourself, right? But it's interesting how in the fantasy, you have to kind of sustain it, and it never creates its own kind of energy for it with the other, because if you're getting a high from it, the other can be kind of sacrificing or something. But in the imaginative act, it has this kind of pull along that comes with it, that it kind of grabs, and you go with it. I have more notes that I will pause and throw to Aspasia. Aspasia, please.
It was something to do with when we were talking, just that essentially what we're describing now too is enactment. So we're just talking about, this is why the levels of awareness and consciousness matter so much, because essentially, like the narcissistic parent is one example of this, but we all do it to varying degrees. We enter into relationship, and there are two sets of unconsciouses there, and they get all entangled and entwined with one another, and they pull for certain kinds of expression and certain kinds of dynamics, which are going to be familiar or are going to be the thing that just keeps everything smooth enough for the individual. And we don't know that this is happening, and it distorts the way that we perceive the other person. It colors our emotional state, and this is that essentially the acting out of fantasy, if we want to talk about it in those terms. This is the way that we are sort of more implicitly acting out these dynamics all the time with one another, without seeing it, without realizing and knowing it. And so when we think about when we think about this sort of analyzing that we were just talking about, right? Like the analyzing is important to be able to sort of sit down and purposely reflect on what might be my contribution here. What is it that I am doing when I enter these dynamics? What am I pulling for? What shoes am I asking this other person to step into unknowingly? Is there a pattern here? Do I do this all the time? We can do that level of analysis, and we do it together. I agree, we have to do it together. There's only so far you can get by yourself. But people, there's that version, but then there's kind of the cheapened, flattened version of that where people think they're doing that. And really it's just another one of these examples of going, like, just reinforcing that actually everything I'm doing here is fine. I'm the open one. I'm the one that's, you know, it's the other person that is again trying to do this to me or do that to me. And we just go back to these familiar narratives, which is actually all just part of the acting out. It's not insightful. It doesn't get us anywhere further. And I think that it's almost the sign that we are actually approaching, we are bringing something up more from the pre-conscious bin, if you will, is that we do start to have anxiety. We do start to have uncomfortable emotions in our body. When we're with another person and we're doing this, that's important. Whereas, you know, everything in society teaches us to run away from that now. You know, that's bad, you shouldn't feel that way. Obviously there are versions of this that are not good, you know, when you're stuck in abusive dynamics and it's being induced in you as opposed to you willingly entering into it. But, you know, in a broader sense, it is the feeling, it's the feeling anxious, and it's the feeling uncomfortable, and it's the wrestling with these very strange emotional states and stuff that's happening in the body that starts to emerge that we don't like having. But doing that together with someone else is the thing that is most likely to bring up, how do you talk about it? It helps us to be able to bring conscious awareness to aspects of how we are in dynamics with people that have not previously been consciously aware to us. Like, and this is how we start. And that's why I go on and on about emotions and anxiety, because if you follow them in a particular way, within the bounds of a particular kind of relationship, that's the starting point. That is the thread that once you pull on it and you follow that, it's not the thinking first. It's not the, I don't know how to put it. It's you have to pull on the thread of that, and you don't really know what it's going to lead to, and you don't know why you're trying to enhance this feeling in your body, and you don't know where this is going to lead, and it's terrifying. But when you do that, then it's almost like the information then comes on the other side of that. Then you can start to see anew, oh, I understand now why I find myself in these dynamics where this always ends up happening, or when I'm with this person, I always end up feeling like a victim at the end. It's that way round. That's what I'm trying to say. And so there is this kind of dance between, I guess, the kind of the seeing and the knowing, and that's very important. And there's a way that all these processes can get hijacked again by the unconscious forces of just continuing to act out over and over again the same patterns, without having that sort of conscious awareness of why you're doing what you're doing. And so even the analyzing and the thinking together and all of that can just be used to go round and round in circles again and keep one feeling very sort of contained and in control, and not too much anxiety and really not much emotion. And I think that's what used to frustrate me so much when I used to, you know, a long time ago, try and watch people having philosophical conversations online, is that they were just these very ordered, very, like, you know, men talking to each other, and just this, and they just seemed to have zero anxiety, zero emotions, and it just felt like this weird masturbatory act. I don't know what it was. I couldn't relate to it whatsoever. I didn't find it appealing or interesting or insightful, and it didn't seem to me like they were like. There's obviously exceptions, but they didn't really genuinely seem to be wrestling with anything. They were doing it in a way where they were almost performing that they were wrestling with something. And I think this is part of what I was experiencing, is that difference. You know, are you willing to go into a conversation and feel really uncomfortable, even if other people see that you are, in the pursuit of this, to really fully try and uncover something new about yourself, about the way that you're operating, about the way you are in dynamics of people? I just think that's so vitally important, and you can't cut that out of all of this as well. You know, that part is just as important as the relational, because that's the part we bring into relationship. So like they're informing one another. Anyway, I'm getting very heightened about it
No,
all.
everything you're saying is extremely spot on. I think, and I'll throw it to Mr. Luber here. I think first, when you pull on the anxiety, that would be the rationality has to follow the non-rational. Like it has to. And the problem is when people don't pull anything, then thinking is just tracing. It's just creating internally consistent systems. And so you're never encountering the girdle point. Thinking cannot encounter the girdle point. It cannot lead there. But if you're willing to pull on the anxiety, then thinking has no choice but to go there, actually. Like that's kind of the key, is that non-rationality kind of forces rationality in a certain direction. And it does make me think a bit of what McGilchrist at the beginning of his book talks about with the left brain. Rather, one buys it, it's fine. But the point is that he's saying that people who damage their right brain can't help but make up explanations for everything. They're never wrong. Actually, like this is kind of a key dimension, is they always can generate an explanation, even if it's like fundamentally absurd, right? And so the issue is that like if you do not inject something non-rational, surprise, some sort of encountering of unknownness, you're just going to generate internally consistent systems. You're just going to be creating tracing. Thinking becomes tracing as opposed to pulling on something that opens something up. And then the problem is that if you end up doing that, you don't know you've done that because you're in the system, so you can't know you're doing it. And so the human being at every moment of the day is susceptible to the problem of creating an internally consistent system and not knowing they're doing it. And if you do not design the space to fight against that, if you do not go into the anxiety, and Michelle and I will talk about all the time, is basically the choice of facing fear, like as a heuristic. Like if you're afraid, lean into that. If you don't know what to do, find out what you're afraid to do and lean into that. That becomes a pretty good heuristic for determining the non-rationality that will, boom, open something that redirects rationality. That if you don't do, it's simply going to end up creating some sort of stillness, some sort of equilibrium. That's problematic. But let me give it to Luber here. Mr. Luber, please.
Yeah, I got two things I want to talk about. One, Wynn's comment, which I want to talk about second, and then but first, Aspasia. I really love what you're saying because like I think about that all the time, and I have like a question for you, honestly, because this is a real impasse here because it's like in my mind, I wish. Now I haven't watched like that many Jordan Peterson or John Vervaeke. Like I watched probably more than the average person, but like still not as much as I know others, but I would want them to be like, yeah, I just haven't been fucking my wife. And it's fucking annoying. And today's discussion is going to be influenced by that emotion. Like literally like that kind of stuff. But then I'm like, hold on. There's certain things that are like private. There's certain things that are like aren't appropriate. But yet, so like my question is like, how do you communicate the line? Because I want that. Like I want to be able. I don't have that problem. I guess the people with the actual names have that problem, in my opinion, where it seems like I don't care about what they're saying because there's not that existential element in what they're saying. Like I don't why do they care about it? And like not even just like I care about it because blah 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 AGI kind of thing. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, it has to do with AGI, like something that's not even real and immediate in the sense of like affecting their actions right now around them kind of thing. But my mind always goes to like the most, I just had to start taking Viagra, erectile dysfunction. Today's discussion is going to be about lack. I wish it could be like it's something like that, but that's like too vulgar. Like obviously, I'm thinking very vulgar just to make my point. So there's that question that I have. Like what's the line of communication? Like I definitely think like again with Daniel and like when you're a good example of like a good line. But like how do we actually articulate that? Like you're doing the actions. It's too propositionally explosive to explain in a certain sense. So it's like I know what's going on in your life because you send like the weekly, that email. So it's like I know, like, oh, like, okay, he's coming from this place, and I've been following your work for so long that it's like you're like part of my conversations with like Jockin and Javier, even though you're not even there, kind of thing. Like it needs to be like that. Like I couldn't do that with like any of, but that's because I'm like personally friends with you. Like, like when you get too big, and I think I said this on the net, where it's like past net, when you get too big, you lose your friendship with your audience. You have to. There's too many people, and like with my Arfid Andrews shit, like I've definitely experienced that. And I'm not even that big, but like uh, people that are like actually big, like I don't know how it's just so disingenuous to come off in that like there's an intimacy, there's that friendship, but it's impossible. There's no way. So I guess it turned out to be two questions. The communication line, like what's the proper communication line? And then second is from like a tribe or communal standpoint, what is too big where you actually lose intimacy? Is there an actual line? Now, I know there's some people like Bard who are like, it's 1500. The Socion's 1500. It can't be more. If it's more than 1500, it's just fucking chaos. It'll turn into chaos. And like, I don't know. I don't know enough about that. And that's obviously like a sociological question, which I know, you know, you read a lot about that stuff. So, okay, that's the first thing. The second thing, which is what Win was saying, I just want to read it because for the video, people might not know. Is there a way of experiencing things where there isn't that split, that duality? Like, and in my opinion, I mean, I want to talk, I guess, about like Heidegger and Dasein for a second, because I know you know all about that. So to me, what Heidegger's doing is very much, and same with like Aristotle, like it's very much this, okay, like you need to have one, you need the other kind of move. There's this, you're being in the world, it's like, it's not this separate thing. There's not this subject object divide, but in a certain sense, this being in a world, you could parcel out the feedback loop in a certain sense. So it's like, uh, and I talked about this with like Jockin and Javier recently, like my client, where he's like very smart and he has like hot political takes, and his political takes are like, fuck the other people, they should go jump in a fire and die. Like, and I'm just like, okay, but then you're jumping in the fire and dying if that happens. Like, you're just gonna destroy yourself. So like, you're real smart. Why don't you think of like a contrasting position that is actually something that is contrasting your position, and it'll elevate your own position, and it'll be this back and forth, boom, 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 and it's gonna just keep going up in a certain sense. And he's like, oh, that's a great idea. So in a certain sense, there's like this divide in positions, but yet at the same time, there's the understanding of a lack of separation, that there's a necessity. If there's one, there must be the other. And I think it's very much analogous to Heidegger's Dasein. And I think like what Heidegger does with like his reveal and conceal is very much this, like, he kind of like bottles up this like Hegelian dialectic move very, very succinctly in this like reveal and conceal move. And in that sense, you could, now this is like a little abstract, not feeling too positive about it, but for the sake of argument, it's like, in a certain sense, the subject-object divide for Heidegger could be reveal and conceal. Like within, if you are in the analysis, you are in a certain sense attuned to what's being revealed and concealed in regard to the mood that you're already in. And like, that is the the analysis of Dasein to some extent. And there's that ping pong effect that the subject object was like idealistically supposed to have. So with that being said, I think there's these moments of realizing the necessity of both the subject and object. And in these moments, we would call that like the beatific strike. But leading up to those moments, things are a divide in a certain respect. And it's how you how you hold that divide is essentially how you then prepare for those moments. Because if you don't hold that divide properly, and what I mean by properly, it's then you need the one to have the one, you need the other. Like that, if you're holding that stance, if you're trying to hold different, in other words, realizing the difference is at the root of your being in the world, then you're going to be able to see these moments where you're experiencing life moment without the divide. That is what I'm proposing, I guess. So I just want to kind of respond to that and kind of outline that. That was a little choppy, but yeah, that's it.
Outstanding. And I'll throw it to Wim, but Aspasia, feel free to reply to anything. I guess what I would just say quickly is I think that tension of scale, I think that tension of revealing and unrevealing what is proper to say, what is not. I think again for me there's a courage heuristic in that as well, right? Like I think that's like when you're like, I'm not going to say this that I know would actually be fitting to say because it will risk my audience. That's when you start getting into trouble, right? Like when you're not consciously in the conversation aware, there's something there that's interesting to think of the line. Like when you're in a conversation, when you feel that conscious feeling of, I know what's actually the fitting thing to discuss, but actually I'm not because of the risk to the audience or my brand or something, then that's when you actually do need to say it. Like there's something about active thinking in the discussion that I'm now pondering. But I will pause and I will throw it to Mr. Wynn. Mr. Wynn, it is wonderful to see you.
Pleased to be here. Every time I say, oh, it's been a while, then I kind of go astray away from the net. It's really always a pleasure to be back because it's this is the space where I can truly think. I think I can think in this space, but not also think, but like also feel, be myself, question myself, put myself into question, which is the point of philosophy. Obviously, psychotherapy, psychology, psychoanalysis is the question of like meaning, truth, who we are, who we aren't, what we were, what we expect to be. The main point I wanted to make, it goes to Andrew's question, but it also goes to what Aspasia said about even kind of what she made a comment about, like philosophy being on a call, questioning things which seem quite abstract and caught up in, I'm saying it in a different way, but like caught up in language which could be a way of repressing emotions and like one's own subjective trauma, one own's projection into the future. I do just like still today where I am at with philosophy, and especially what I've been working on more recently, I think it always comes to a perspective which doesn't try to make a dualism of fantasy and reality, not because there isn't any difference in the quality of experience. Like when somebody touches your arm, there is a different kind of experience which is different to when I close my eyes and think about an experience, what happened last week. You know, there is obviously a qualitative difference between that experience. But I think our cultures, our philosophies have divided that experience or compartmentalized those experiences into quite hardline boxes, which have helped us make sense of, for example, like representational abstract thinking of me in this room and what it is like outside by the sea. You know, like there's an obvious difference, but I think philosophy has kind of ontologized that distinction, extremely ontologized it to the point where we then think, as to go to what Andrew was saying, like as subjects, we need to kind of overcome this mental bridge between subject and object. Either like philosophy by correctly modern philosophy by correctly representing the thing itself of the outside, or for example, for psychology, the inside. So I think some psychology, especially psychology, but also psychotherapy, is kind of to allow the representation to sort of like ease out those inner experiences from the past and how then you relate to yourself in the present. And I think each way that we tackle philosophy or psychology or self-introspection, I think there is only one truth, and it still is that truth of allowing my idea of the beach outside to be, and to say there is some qualitative truth to that experience of my idea of that beach, or if somebody did something 10 years ago and it has affected the way I then relate to other people, it's allowing that dynamic and behavior and form of behavior to be. And I think therapy is so beautiful in that respect, that it allows oneself to let that experience be. In a way, like, my point is to say that the word experience is really good at capturing not simply the split between mentalization and the thing itself. It's allowing the very experience where what becomes most true is that very experience of letting it be. So then this is go back to Andrew's point about Heidegger. He does try to think beyond your idea of something and the thing itself, because he would say that actually when you experience this opening up of experience, this is philosophy, and I think it is pure philosophy, and it sounds like mental masturbation because it seems like you're not confronting yourself in that experience. But I think pure philosophy is the question of truth, which doesn't avoid your own specific history, your own specific traumas. It actually allows them to thrive and come forth. And I think the true dynamic, just from what I have experienced in my best moments, is when I can realize that I'm conditioned by society, by the way that we all have related to each other, by the way that we think about each other. But there is something truth. And I think the truth of psychotherapy is to get you to that experience of letting be. Because in that experience, I think the breakdown between fantasy and reality happens. Like, there is a breakdown where you realize actually poetry, for example, is kind of subjective, of your own history, of a specific world that is opening up in that experience. But the very experience of poetry takes away the division between hard, raw reality and language. And I think that's a very weird, mystical place which seems to avoid emotions. It avoids past traumas in a way. But actually, because poetry is someone's own history, it introduces a world, and that world speaks to another world. So I think we shouldn't kind of demonize language or thinking. So this is part of my own philosophy. I think there is a thinking which can think outside of the split between subject object, the fantasizer and the fantasized, So I think, for example, to go back to libido, I think one of my comments at the beginning when I was listening downstairs was like, the most libidinal moments of my life is not when I'm like, because there was a period in my life when I listened a lot to Alan Watts and was trying to return to the now and presence without language. I was really happy, but I realized perhaps in those years my libido was quite low. I was like, okay, like, go back to the hardcore reality. And like, as soon as I would fantasize, it's like, stop, that's an abstraction from raw reality. Like, feel the touch, feel the experience, don't think about it. But I really feel like the last 5-6 years have been letting both the thought and the experience feel kind of unified. So Heidegger has this word of gathering, that thinking isn't just a representation of something outside or inside of yourself, and then the representation is either true or false. Instead, it's allowing that what is gathered to your experience, physically, mentally, to be gathered. It's like giving it space, So when you are intimate with someone, I think it's actually the most beautiful thing to, with your thinking, without choosing it, introduce that person's history, introduce your memories, introduce the excitement of the projection of the future. And in a way that seems like fantasy, but I think there's a quality of fantasy which is kind of like an allowance to the beauty. And this goes back to like what we used to speak a lot in the net about beauty, the beauty of the idea, the beauty of the person. Because in a way, like, for example, my partner, if I think about her now, it seems like I'm trying to represent her in my head. And like, instead I should just go to her and touch her physically and say, this is truth. And now my current emotion is truth. But I think there's something about a way of relating to that person, my partner, where I can think of her, allow her to cross my mind and realize the beauty of that. And I think there is something weird about that experience where the division between fantasy and reality sort of breaks down. But then I'm also aware, and this is, I think I'm quite political in that sense, also like self-political over myself, my space, is I'm aware of my conditioned behavior. I'm aware of the way that I might be thinking. I catch myself being stupid. I catch myself with certain preconditioned ideas. I'm not saying I don't take responsibility, but I think good therapy is introspection, keeping that sort of like self-dialogue open with the other, with someone who cares about you. but also being aware that maybe there are those sort of like, and this goes back to what, sorry if I'm talking too long, what Andrew answered the question, like, so I said, is there a way of experiencing things where there isn't that split, that duality? And Andrew's answer, I think, is true in a way. It's like only for a moment, I'd say, but how we experience the split or the lack of a split maybe prepares us for, maybe then you could say, like, those moments in society when we deal with the political real, when we deal with the contradictions of desire, and maybe a type of fantasy which is like wanting to exterminate other people because they fantasize that that person is like the possible scapegoat for their own, you know. So then of course, like, the critique of ideology is this: you're critiquing the social construction of a specific fantasy. Maybe the problem, and this is Heidegger's critique of technology, well, not technology itself, there's nothing in itself wrong with technology, but technological thinking presupposes that there is an object to be dominated, either through like an accurate representation, and it closes off conversation, it closes off surprise, or through domination, as in like a standing reserve of like labor. So if you are a capitalist in a very sort of like global industrialist way, a human becomes a resource for production. And if that becomes your truth, your fantasy, the social fantasy, there is space to critique that politically. And in a way, that's why maybe therapy is kind of like self-politic. It's like allowing yourself to be aware that we all live within the sort of subject-object split of culture. How are we dealing with that? What kind of language are we using? You know, but I think philosophy is that weird space where it does sort of tend to shy away, even for a moment, because it does seem like it's sort of masturbatory in the sense that we're questioning things like beauty and the good, without maybe the question of subject. But yeah, it's great to be back. I will try my best to be here next time. I promise.
Well, it is always a complete delight to have you, and that was completely magnificent. Thank you for sharing all of that. I mentioned McGilchrist. Something that I'm doing is comparing James Wiggy and lyrical philosophy with McGilchrist, which I find very, very interesting, because James Wiggy, on this whole idea that McGilchrist is so famous for, with the need to have the right brain have more influence on the left brain, it's interesting how he presents it. I would argue that James Wiggy is actually kind of making a similar argument with Gestalt theory, but she thinks you need to do it with poetry, with literature, and a certain sort of having the philosophy. She'll do it where the philosophy is on the left hand of the page, and the poetry and the literature is on the right, and how there's this kind of idea that you really can't grasp what is being said unless there are opportunities to apprehend a notion, because poetry gives you a chance to apprehend something, if you let it wash over you. Right? Because poetry doesn't really work if you don't let it wash over you. And there's actually a suggestion in James Wiggy that if one thinks about having the right brain have more of a say in a calculation mindset without opportunities of practicing the right brain apprehension, then you're never going to get there. In fact, you'll never actually overcome the split, because you'll be thinking about the split as opposed to entering. What's very interesting is, when I think of my own life, what are those spaces what makes the subject-object divide go away? The thinking to make it go away, or entering into spaces where I find that it has gone away, right? And so I think there's something architectural, and I think about imagination, where the kids say, come into the fort. There's a sense when the kids say, come into the fort, the subject-object divide goes away, because you're in play. Like, there's something about play that makes it go away, right? And you have to enter play. It's kind of interesting how the subject-object divide is about entering something, going into something, experiencing something. And the suggestion is that what James Wiggy is putting forth is that poetry is entering into that mindset. Like, that's the use of language that is the entering into that mindset. And if you don't, and so there is a possibility of language being part of the solution, part of the address, if you will, if presented in the right way as a certain kind of space that you go into. And it is a very strange mode of thought when you enter into the geopathic, and so I guess also I want to say there is one of the reasons why certainly I do spaces like this or the net or these kind of conversations is because there's some mysterious way of using language or philosophical discourse that becomes a space like a poem in the way that Jan Zwiggy is talking about, where apprehension happens mysteriously, suddenly, and it's surprising. Right? Like Mr. Jockin made the point where surprise is antithetical to the fantasy, where in imagination, it's all about surprise, right? And there is something about a way of using language in a certain space that actually creates the apprehensive effect that is more like seeing something or touching something than it is trying to mentally represent that of which you use the conversation to correspond to. And that kind of unfolding of experience seems to be very, very important. I think the other thing that I'm thinking too is there is something about, obviously Hegel, and I'll give it to Michael and Mr. Jock and anyone else on this fine day. Obviously, there's this kind of idea in Hegel that if we thinking to itself, from that, we can go on the entire phenomenological journey, derive the categories, and so on and so forth. There's something suggested here that if libidinal thought can think itself libidinally, like if libidinal thought can libidinally unfold itself, that actually it will generate the conditions where the subject-object divide are gone, because we enter into a different relation to ourselves and to thought in that libidinal unfolding. And I suppose the idea is maybe we can think of fantasy that's not faced and overcome, like in Hegel, it's like understanding doesn't move over to reason, right? So it can't move on unless you go through the work of basically having understanding encounter its limits, and then it opens up into reason, which doesn't leave understanding behind, but sublates it, and becomes and kind of has that self-reflexivity onto itself. So likewise, fantasy that is kind of saturated into itself through libidinal thought actually opens it up to these spaces we can enter where the subject-object divide goes away. And I think the term that you use that seems to be completely correct is a certain letting. When you jump into the fort with the kids, you let yourself, you let the game wash over, you let the play occur. There's a letting that happens, and you're thinking in service of the letting. You're not thinking, should I be doing or not? You've accepted the space, and now you're thinking on how to enhance the play. You're thinking on how to let the play happen, how to let the libidinal energy flow. It is very thinking as more like coordinating the direction of a flow is very different from thinking that's trying to ask if flow should happen or not, or if it's real or something like that. But it turns out that a lot of thinking is actually needed to let being be, to let the play go forth, right? Because there will be moments when you might get angry at another kid not playing correctly, or be the moments when you're tired, and being able to ask yourself, am I right to be upset? Does it really matter if I get upset with them? Or what would be the next best move? This can actually let the play unfold, right? Or the thinking can be in service of the cipher by which things can come forth. I have more notes, but I will pause and throw it to Michael here and then Mr. Jockin. Michael, please.
Yeah, I was thinking about Luber's no longer on the call, but his point about kind of encountering Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke, and like there almost being like an absence of some sort of energy, or maybe like an existential. I mean, it's kind of ironic because John Vervaeke's talking about, the meaning crisis. Like he's talking about these existentially critical times, right? But there's a way in which, and like I don't think I would spaces without people like that. Like that, I mean, that in many ways was like my introduction to philosophy. And so I'm like deeply indebted to them. But I think for me personally, I started to realize after a while of consuming a lot of like philosophical content, and learning about ideas, and like kind of just this whole world opening. It was kind of like a bell curve where there was this peak of like, wow, like there's a world of people who think about means to be alive. Like this is kind of such a revelation. And then there was this feeling of like you know how when you see a postcard of the Grand Canyon, like it can be like both this kind of wowing experience, but also it's like, well, why do I need to go see it now that I've seen a picture of it? You know, like everything, like that kind of that notion, like everything's being explored, everything's been invented. Like what, you know, what's the point of discovering new things? There was kind of this experience of like I've accumulated these ideas and these thoughts, and now what? Like, and I think there's this feeling sometimes with philosophy where it's people kind of merely regurgitating old thinkers' thoughts instead of trying to actively be on the precipice of like the cutting edge of creating new thought. And that can feel like, as a listener, it can feel like kind of this like warm blanket, you know, it's kind of this nice feeling. But there's yeah, I mean, like as I say this, like I don't even know if it's fair to necessarily put Vervaeke and Peterson in that camp completely, because like, you know, Vervaeke, if you watch his like After Socrates series and these like dialectic into dialogos sessions that he does, like he's like that's him like doing philosophy in my opinion. And like if you watch Peterson's Genesis lectures, it's like you can see him like on the precipice of like new thought, and it is like very, like I would argue it's like very libidinal. um but in general, I think sometimes philosophy is more in the business of um either kind of mere like paraphrasing of old thought, or kind of mere analysis, where it's kind of this like subject object thing where there isn't the involvement of the soul, of the emotional body, and it's, you know, it's kind of merely an intellectual exercise. And I think spaces like this, where I mean people are bringing in like articles that they're actively working on, you know, like they're bringing in their half-baked thoughts, which sometimes it's pretty marvelous to see what some of y'all's half-baked thoughts look like. But it's like it's a playground. It's like it's a playground for thought. It's not a it's not a like whose thought is the smartest, you know, or whose thought's the best, or um you know, like, or just merely like here's what I read and I thought that's interesting. Like it, like there's like existential stakes of here's thoughts that like are sorely needed, because here's the reality on the, you know, here's the reality on the ground. And actually like I was talking to, I think it was in a moment yesterday, or whenever we had our conversation, Daniel, where you were away with Paul, and I was telling Michelle, like, for me, the people that I've met in this corner of the internet, like the similarity that it seems like they all have is that philosophy for them is like is survival. It's not just a luxury. It's not just a nice to have. It's not just what you do if you have a bunch of time and money and you know, you twiddle your tie and you talk about books. Like it's there's a there's like an existential necessity, and a lot of people come to it through experiences where they realize doing philosophy literally saved my life, right? And so that's, I think, you know, I mean, Luber was kind of using like a tongue-in-cheek example, but I would imagine, I think that's part of it. And I feel that way too. Like I don't listen to philosophical, you know, podcasts anymore where someone doesn't talk about their personal life, like at least once, you know, when it's just purely, here's what I think Hegel thinks. It's like, well, why do you care? Like, I want to know why you care about this. And it's not to say that that person does it. And yeah, there's a time and place for that. And I understand, not all interviews cater to that. And some are more about like presenting ideas and what someone's researched and stuff. But I think that's why so many people gravitate towards the TLC, because it's like Paul Vanderklay's just interviewing random people and just talking to them about their life. And they're not credentialed, scholarly necessarily people. But they're people who think deeply about life. Yeah, exactly. And also critically, like people who don't have these big audiences that they feel. And I think why a lot of people are turning away from Peterson, because he's become subject to the ideological tribe that he's kind of become identified with and become a part of. And there's something like dishonorable about that in the philosophical endeavor. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
No, very well said, and I'll give it to Mr. Jochen here. I think that notion of survival and people have experiences that go, my survival depends on it, and I think that with the loss of givens and global pluralism, the likelihood that the average person encounters an experience where they come to feel as if their life depends on philosophy is higher. And also the likelihood that people use philosophy as I would say it should be used, which is tied to existential stakes and navigating non-obvious self-evident, answers between people, and that entail you having to deal with your own self-deception. How do you solve a problem that you're the problem, How do you solve the problem when you're the problem, when you're part of the problem set? And there's a part of philosophy that's the realization that your survival is tied to you dealing with the problem that is you. And then doing that in the context of other people of whom their problem is themselves. And then there's the complexity between all of you. And then that's magnified by the loss of givens and interconnectedness and etc., so forth. So yes, that's very important. I think also, like there's audience dynamics, all of that you're saying, that becomes such a big thing. And I think the one thing I'll say, and then I'll pass it to Jochen and then Daniel here, is on that idea of the gathering. So one thing I'll say, a giant claim, whatever it is you gather in your life, if it doesn't lead to apprehension and insight, it will feel empty and dead. So what ends up happening is if you gather philosophical discussion and you gather and gather and gather and gather, but it doesn't lead to an apprehension, like seeing all the little small pictures, and then suddenly like you see the big picture, what the sailor cannot find, the insight, this moment of apprehension, it will feel dead to you. So likewise, if you gather all the genealogy of your family and you gather all the memories, but it doesn't lead to a apprehension of how your dad saw you or something, it will seem like a meaningless task. Like if you go around the world and travel to all these places and gather all these experiences and there's no apprehension, it will be dead to you, right? So what ends up happening is like, for me in these kind of philosophical spaces, they feel meaningful to the degree that there's this gathering of conversation, gathering a new thought you never had before, and you see something that you've never thought before, and you feel like you can apprehend the world after the conversation in ways you couldn't apprehend it before, right? And that's where it doesn't feel masturbatory. It feels, productive, procreation. What's the difference between procreation and masturbation? I think masturbation is gathering that doesn't lead to insight. Like here's the key. We've made the giant mistake of thinking the procreation is the conclusion. We think the conclusion, the calculation is the procreation. No, the procreation is the apprehension, the insight, the seeing, as Jochen was pointing to earlier in the discussion, the seeing of something like new eyes, the gestalt, the whole, the strike of beauty, right? And so that is what all gathering must afford. But it will not afford that if you haven't developed virtue, if you're hiding your ego in a fantasy, if you're not feeling yourself fully, you're not touching or in touch, you can't have apprehension. You can't have the bam. You can't see it all come together. So you have to do self-work so that the things you gather create apprehension. Otherwise, everything you gather will be vanity of vanities and fragments. And so there is self-work necessary so the gathering can afford an experience to you that is not reducible to your self-work. There's a facing of your own negativity so that something can occur that is not reducible to just you facing your negativity, that it's procreative beyond you, that there's a third, right? But the issue is, a lot of times it will be, what can happen is when you start experiencing content that you can't gather because it's too slick or it's too smooth or it doesn't have openings to let other things you've thought connect with it. It's too complete, actually. It's too much a finished package. So then what ends up happening is you can't gather it. You can collect it, but you can't put it together with anything. And so it becomes glass beads in a Herman Hesse novel, or it becomes Pokemon that you can use to win a cocktail hour or something, right? But it's not going to be gathering, and it can't make an apprehension. So you have to find discussion or art spaces or family spaces, or et cetera, so forth, where you feel this coming togetherness. Yeah, got to catch them all. Where you feel this coming togetherness. And that coming togetherness is going to afford the possibility of apprehension and insight and gestalt, which is the James Wiggy and the right brain and all of those different things. But the issue is also you can't create spaces of gathering without virtue, because the people will start fighting, or they'll not get along, or they won't try to meet one another. So then that won't occur. So basically what ends up happening is, at scale, well, there's also a scale principle where the more people involved, the lower the probability that everyone has the virtue necessary in order to hold the space together in a manner that makes possible apprehension. So you then just go into complete pictures and complete finished things, because you can scale that and not worry about anything. But then it becomes flat, equilibrium, and dead. So there's a category of virtue, nervous system regulation, control of the body, being in touch, that is the necessary precondition so that there can be gathering that makes possible apprehension. And if there is an apprehension, then it will feel dead. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin and then Daniel here. Mr. Jockin.
I'm sorry, the chat's on fire.
Yeah, the
today.
chat's on fire, actually.
Chat's on fire. Okay. Getting serious. Okay. I think the big note when Daniel, your reply and Thomas Wynn's first comment, I think the letting go aspect is to qualify it. I had in my notes self-forgetting, but then actually from the earlier discussion, what mode of the self are we talking about? It's the ego self. It's that letting go of the ego. For it, I actually think, again, I could be corrected, but from my reading of that mirror phase from Lacan, it's actually in the ego release, in the activity of play, right? Of the play in the fort, that have this experience, like those play moments of the geopitic, you get to have a moment in reflection when you can recall and say, it's in a space of elsewhere, as we said in the beginning, like the images of the elsewhere, you actually get, here I am. You find out who you are by the elsewhere. I only say that because let me give you an example. So the term geopitic came from Stomping Ground last year, because it was such a divine experience. And Javier, myself, and Michelle got together and we were talking through what is different about this spirit space from the university classroom. Why is this so different? And talking through the qualities of that, and then coming up with the terming difference of algorithmic and geopitic. But the main note is, in the activity of reflection, we actually got revealed the new reality. So this is actually what Daniel note about, a new reality got revealed to you, right? The gathering gave you an insight, apprehension of, I am here. I am actually more full. This is why I'm saying this language of the iPhone, like this mode of selfness, kind of self-forgetting, that language would be a little bit attenuated by saying what mode of the self. It's the ego self, because you actually more come fully yourself and letting go of the ego. It's very fun. There's corollaries in Islamic psychology about this. So the nafs versus the nur, the ruh, that it's the same lot. It's corollary to like a ego versus with a nafs and a real self. I don't want to call is Lacan's the I function? Who knows? Anyways, you can correct me on that. But they kind of, I am here. They kind of like, I'm using that language, I am here, on purpose, because here's in a place. And actually, I think generally know in my work in beauty, it is very much place that everything rests on this point. It is in the place of this body. Like thisness, particularity, hexity, lack is in place. It is thus like the placeness of a thing, both in the mental sense, but all in the physical sense, in the time sense, in place, everything kind of conjoins, right? It's the touch point of eternity in here and now, right? And it also allows the access point for memory to come through, strike through, et cetera, et cetera. I think that, and that memory part is really important, because actually something from Aspasia said earlier, I think is very important. you self-deceive yourself because you can't see the patterns of what you're doing. And that's generally, I always say it because I was catching up with a friend yesterday, and she was making comments about, yeah, it was actually, I really want to get into jump rope, like the boxing jump rope training. Like, they do the whole coronation. And then she said, and then later, about maybe 30 minutes later, she was like, we were on this thread topic, came back to, oh yeah, I also really want to do tennis. Like I want to and I observed it. I was like, hey, Pamela, I think, do you think you're, I'm gonna ask you a question. Do you feel like you're clumsy? Do you feel like you're a clumsy person? She was like, well, why do you say that? I was like, I don't know. You seem to be very fixated about this hand-eye, and you're talking about the hand-eye coordination. Like you're really emphasizing this point about the hand-eye coordination. And she started looping. Like she actually had a moment of like, wait, is that an issue? Is that something I'm concerned? Like, and I just pointed out, listen, I'm just observing a pattern. That's all I'm doing. I don't know. The very fact that maybe you need to chew on that a little bit. I'm just pointing out, like, I think a big part of our self-deception is that this is where Aristotle's sense of memory is so important. The inductive act of seeing universals requires memory. If you have no memory, you can't see patterns. You can't see patterns. You can't get the universals. So this is just an example of how, in a practical sense, how it plays out. Let alone is, again, an issue of health. Because, for example, if you keep doing the same action and getting a negative outcome, but you can't remember that this is the cause effect, this is the relationship. I do this and this happens. You're not going to attenuate. You can't address it. Like that's also, I think it's also very important about this. I think this is the last note. On this point. So like why, this is actually very important because actually I was still one last question about the geopedic with the experience of Summit Ground, because, so here's very important. We got the encounter, we let go. We had this great geopedic experience. We had a new revealing of what might be the case, right? New insights, and I also say that because it was true. It wasn't an end to itself, because what happened was, I want to speak for, I'll say this, Javier and Luber and me, like before, our social relationship was like, we would like check in, but you had to formalize the talk. Like you had like schedule a talk, like at this time, it was a very coordinated thing versus we're just on Instagram. Like we're on an Instagram, like DM group chat thing. And then we just like randomly call each other. Like, do you notice the completely change of relationship of time with each other? That happened for Stumping Ground. It wasn't prior. I can tell you exactly what happened. Let alone again, Michelle and Javier and me, again, we just like dropped in, we jumped into a DM chat of Instagram, IG chat, and just like went and just used that as an archive space. And then we would just bounce off each other asynchronously on ideas related to what we're talking about. So what I'm getting at here is, why I'm bringing this up, there's one note about technology and asynchronicity in time, and synchronicity in time and social relation related to that. It's interesting. But that more relevant point is, here's very important. This idea of the beautiful is beyond telos. Telos is always of the good. It is always of the good. That's what telos is about, is the end. And a comment, and I'm going to write about it this week, actually. This weekend, I plan on writing about it from the last net session from Sunday. I'm still thinking about it. I didn't even get to talk about this. I'm still thinking about it, though. The obsession of the law, so we don't have to think. If I just follow the law of the symbolic order, I will be good. Which is actually a mode of not thinking. You don't get to think. You just follow the law. It's algorithmic. Because it's tied to, and I say that, and that's another way of talking about the capture of the image of being good by replication of the image of the law. Of it. This is what needs to be good. I need to be this. And when I fail that good, I'm bad. I'm guilty. Right? But then I say that's because another side is that if you have the geopedic experience, this is why beauty gets captured by the good. That's why it always has glimmers. Because if we try to replicate Stumping Ground to get Geopedia again as a final as an end, we will never get it. You can't. It runs away from you. You'll be trapped and you won't be able to get it. You have to that's why, again, this letting go mode is absolutely true. You got let it go. You cannot get to be an object of the good as a good to be captured by algorithmic logic that if I just do these protocols and do these certain things, or also said, if I talk to certain people, I relate to certain people, I will get this. There's no guarantee. I think it's that kind of demand of the guarantee. Is that we're like, well, wait a minute. You mean I have to put myself in an exposed situation of faith? I have to put myself out there in a kind of moment of opening that may or may not be the case? No, I want certainty. That's what I want. Because that's also, I mean, Luber was kind of hinting at the nature of hope. Hope is a very interesting property because, and I'm sorry, I have to say I had to leave because I wanted to talk about this. But the hope aspect is very important because there is a mode of hope that's absolutely about the good, 100%. Like that's, but see, beauty is meant to save all the virtues. It's meant to save all good. It's beauty saves the good and truth. You get all. It's only in beauty you get the all because something like hope is very important. Because the hope, there's a very big difference of an anticipatory expectation of replication, right? Versus the anticipatory of excitement of encounter. Meaning, when you encounter the partial object Michelle as a beloved, that is not just an object of the good, it's a mimetic image, as a phantasm image to gratify some fantasy, but it's an activity of imagination. Oh, look at that. It's participatory, it's of surprise. I'm excited for this opportunity to be in this space, and I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm very excited what's going to happen. Very interesting. I think that's really interesting because actually a big note. I say this also because when I was talking to Luber about this, I'll close on this because obviously my father passed away in December, so I was in process. Like we're working through it. We're chewing on it. But I think a big note is that I know other people who have lost family members, and one thing I notice is there's some individuals who lost their mothers, lost their fathers. They are still they're here, but they're not here. You know where they are? They're back 8 years ago. They're back there. They're back 8 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago. They're captured. They're captured by an image, by a fantasy, because that beloved is not here. This is also the very interesting part and this is very important because they're seeing that beloved as nothing. That the lack and nothing play is absolutely at stake here. I really believe that because if you see the absence of the beloved when they die as nothing, that they are not here with you, that it is nothing in this place, you will be captured. It will become a fantasy of desire, of wish to be with that, to have that person back, and you will be trapped. You will be trapped. You will not let go because you're in an egoic mode of the good that I have with this beloved is no longer with me. It is nothing. Versus, and this is rather, and again, I'm in the process of grieving, so it's interesting. I chew on this. I don't put much weight on these points, what I'm about to say. But when you get to the turnaround, go, what an amazing opportunity that I had this person as my father. You're actually blessed. I was blessed to have this man to be my father. I mean, I'm amazing about even saying this, right? To see oh my God, I could have not had this man be my father, but I did. And I love him. And I love I am blessed to have that relationship. To have had that relationship and to have that relationship. Doesn't get taken away. That the lack is not a nothing. This is where it all comes down to because you're thinking, but he's not here. But he is here. He's with me. And no one gets to take that away from me in any way, in any place. So, but I could see it, I could see the double move happen here. So even all this discussion about the beloved, right, it's a partial object. This is all what comes down to is that this capture of the good is so tempting. It's so tempting because the fantasy image and capture is right there to take you and you can just run away with it. And the transparency about it is so powerful about it. That's also why this whole discussion of psychoanalysis is so important because of the transparency of those vectors of the good, the follow the law of the mimetic image that we desire to have of the good as our telos and end. Very tempting, very animating, right? It allows you a kind of transparency but it gives you the simulacrum of the geopitic space of beauty. Oh, and there's Paul. Very beautiful. That's all I got. I'm going to stop.
No, that's absolutely magnificent. And well, I'm thinking as you're speaking there that there's something about how the processing of death. So there's grief that leads to apprehension, and then there's grief that leads to an inability to bring together. You're stuck in it. What's interesting is that what you're speaking about with your father changes the quality of when lack is not nothing. Lack can change the quality of apprehension. It can change the way by which you apprehend reality and how things go together. And he loves the carpets. What's interesting is when lack is not nothing, they're lacking, they're not nothing, then they can possibly change the quality of how you apprehend reality, how you apprehend things, how it comes together. But what can happen when somebody passes that, you can't calculate to anything. Like all you have is calculation, and they're gone, and it's nothing, and so it all equals nothing, right? Like it all was for nothing, right? Whereas lack allows an apprehension, the possibility of all those experiences being gathered into something, and it changes how you apprehend. So then if you're stuck in calculation, if you're not able to apprehend, and you're not able to bring it all together, then I think that leads to then it all feels like it's for nothing. And that very logic, I think, basically applies to everything. Like whatever you gather in your life, if it doesn't become, well, what you're saying. So, and then I'll give it to Daniel here, and then I'll probably run this evening, but I'll give it to the wonderful, wonderful Daniel. Like, so a few things. First, place overcomes the subject-object divide. Gathering creates a place. Like you're creating a place. What's interesting is the difference between a collection and a gathering is apprehension. So you don't know if the things you've gathered are just a collection of fragments or a gathering, like it's the word gathering is interesting because a gathering of people, a gathering is a place. It has a place language to it, a gathering and to gather. Right. And so what's interesting is the difference between gathering and collection of fragments is this apprehension, this insight that occurs. And yet, what comes first, the gathering or the apprehension? Right? Like it seems as if you have to take the risk of doing something, not necessarily knowing if there will be an apprehension. And then retrospectively, if it is, it turns out it was a place, actually. It was a gathering, and it was meaningful. But what if it doesn't happen? Well, that means there could be courage. Like you could come to all the net sessions, you could gather a bunch of people together, you could invest a lot of time into someone and never have an apprehension. That, of course, is a possibility. The argument is that the more you develop virtue, the more you do the self-work that you need to do, spiritual work, then the probability of there being the apprehension goes up, but you don't know. And when will it occur? The wind comes and goes, right? But that means you have to face fear. That means there's a certain courage that has to be there because it is the apprehension that changes a collection into a gathering and thus creates a place that you can dwell in. And then once you've created a place, you need to let the place be. Let the place be. Like you're letting the place be, and you're using thinking to defend the letting, not replace the letting, right? Because in a place, you don't have to think, I can just stand here and watch the trees bloom. I don't have to, I can let a place be, but I can't, but I need a place to do that. If I'm thinking a syllogism, no, I have to actively think. There's no letting in syllogism. There's no letting in abstraction, but there's letting in a place. There's letting the spirit, the geopadic, once it's alive, but I have to generate the place where that occurs. And when it occurs is mysterious. Then suddenly and all at once it's occurring. You didn't expect it to occur, like you were saying. You can't engineer it. You just find yourself suddenly in it. But you didn't know you were going to find yourself, and you could gather, do all the logistical planning, you could do all of this stuff, spend all this time, and it never occurs. And then it's suddenly as if it was always going to lead to this. It was always going to lead to the beautiful. It was always going to lead to the geopadic, but you didn't know. But precisely because you didn't know, it could be something of apprehension versus calculation. It could be something of place versus ego. I think the last thing I'll say is it's very interesting with that asynchronicity. Asynchronicity without place is fragments, but with place, it's eternity. So the internet, if you have people that have place, because they can apprehend, that asynchronistic character of the internet can be a participation in something eternal. But without that apprehension, without place as such, then the asynchronicity will serve the Paul Virilio speed that overwhelms our mind. Right? So the internet is a world of asynchronicity. It's always already that. It's already that. So the choice is simply, will it be Virilio speed or will it be eternity? And the difference is the ability to apprehend place, which means you gather that which you can bring together into an insight, into a gestalt. But then that is going to be dependent on one's cultivation of virtue. Let me throw it to Mr. Daniel here. Daniel, thank you for coming, sir.
It's good to be here and good to see you. And I believe there was a birthday recently, so happy birthday as well.
Thank you, sir.
I'm reminded a couple months ago, one of the net sessions really went I think about 4 hours, and the end it was us three. And Daniel, you kind of pulled me out of sleep because where I am, it gets like late in the evening towards the end, and I was going to bed listening to the conversation, and you were like going on about fire. I don't know if you remember that. You were talking about fire. It was epic, and that pulled me out of the sleep, and then that it was a very special conversation for me. It's really cool that it's recorded. But so I was just reminded of that now. But this evening I was at the movies. I watched Hamnet. Hamnet. It's like it's on Hamlet. It's a funny play on word net. I just noticed now, like net, the Hamnet, and like super empty cinema. And then it was really I was stumped. I was speechless for I was with someone. So I was like a very poor accompaniment after the movie because I couldn't speak. It was like resisting the speaking. And also connected, there must have been about 4 other people in the cinemas, and connected with another 2 guys outside the bathroom who you could see that they had been crying. So these like a complete strangers in this mall, empty, late in the evening. Really beautiful experience. But the struggle for us to like find this speech between it's a whole nother thing with and then with the more developed relationship of the person that I went with. That was also a struggle to like find this speech that is appropriate to the experience, and there's like a space for letting a kind of breathing. Well, it's also just kind of circumstantial. I know, Daniel, that the Max Richter piece, The Nature of Daylight, is a meaningful piece of music for you, and that comes in the last scene of this Hamnet. It's like it's an incredible. It's and it's on these themes of grief. Grief is probably like that central thread that then comes into a climax in the putting on of the play of Hamlet. And I haven't read Hamlet, but there's this like somehow I knew of this line. I mean, there's like the famous "to be or not to be," and then there's this when Hamnet knows that he's been poisoned, and then he says, "I am dead." He's still alive. He has a little bit of time. He's ingested the poison, and he's like, "I am dead." That that statement, that contradiction, it's a in John Vervaeke, Guy Sengstock, and what's it, Mastra, forgive me, the paper Dialectic into Dialogos, the pragmatics of nothingness, or something like this. They use this exact example, like your friend comes home and they say, "Oh, I'm dead." So what do you do? Like, what do you do with that? It's obviously a contradiction. They're not dead. So now there's like this invitation. It's a summoner, and I'm kind of like scattershotting all these references out of a wider context of this sentiment for gathering, for apprehension, the sense for poetry in life is also there's a kind of tyranny and emptiness, or it's kind of like it's all signifying something, and what is it signifying? It's like painfully poetic. Everything is now this like like it's got, but you don't want to desensitize yourself to that, but then you're wanting to be informed by that at the same time. It's a I suppose there's something, yeah, I guess there's something about the creative act. There's something about relationship, others, community, speech, that begins to like metabolize or distribute this sense of uh sense of sense of sense of sense of sharedness, but there's a kind of, I don't know, there's something like a terror. This there's something in this film that's really honest in the way that grief seems to be processed between the characters. The mother, particularly for me, was just like astounding. Her performance and the silence in the film as well, and then the way that it folds the play into the production, and it's very special. Like one of those moments that just like basking in art and absurdity, the absurdity of life, like something like this. But it's so frustrating. The pain of expression, trying to fuck. So, but it's yeah, there's something very special just about being alive, and so frustrating about just the difficulty of expressing that, which is then also this drive to art and poetry. I was taken into Finnegan's Wake a couple weeks ago. It was a very it's just like madness. It's just a linguistic. Yeah, I didn't expect to be babbling on so much myself, and it's not so.
No, I think you're getting at something extremely important. I very much want to see that movie, Hamnet. So that experience is the creation of a place. That is a place within a place, a chora, right? When you go into that theater. And then the funny thing, if one were to ask, was it good? That doesn't seem correct, because it was about grief and suffering and terrible. What do we mean by good, right? What if I said it was pleasurable? It was enjoyable. That sounds weird. That doesn't make much sense, right? But if you say something like it was beautiful, oh, okay. That points. And it was beautiful because you couldn't speak. So there's something where listening to characters speak. There was speaking in the movie. There was images in the movie. And all of that was gathered together in such a way that made possible a certain apprehension about life. Not just the movie, but about life through the movie that was relevant to who you were as a human being and the proper way to carry yourself as you left the movie. And the ethical, in a sense, the ethical way by which to behave with other people. All of that, no one had to tell you what to do. No big other had to come along. It flowed out of it, right? It just kind of flowed out of the experience, right? So basically, we see that a movie like Hamnet is composed of grief and striving and courage and moments of doubt. Like the movie as a whole entails all of these things that, when gathered together in the right way, make possible something you would never trade. Like, would you ever trade that experience, right? And also critically, we were speaking earlier about what Aspasia said something about when you pull on the anxiety, you need to pull on it and then thought goes that way. Otherwise, it gets into self-symmetry. So, like, because the point I was making is that thought, rationality has to go the way of non-rationality. It has no choice. It has to go that way. If you see a bird, your mind's going to think about the bird. It's going to go that way. So something that makes great art is art is great when your mind must go its way. Like when it determines the way your mind goes, right? Like it forces your thinking to go a certain way. A work is not good when you can say, oh, that was great, and you stop thinking about it. Great work, you can't will to stop thinking about it. You can't just decide, I'm going to stop thinking about it. No, it's got you. It's pulled you along, right? So it is when you encounter people who, with their very lives, have created chorus and places within place, like that movie, right? Your mind will have to go that way. And so you can be that way to other people if you were to so make your life. And basically, I think often perhaps that feeling of a certain philosophical discourse being empty, or someone is captured, or where is this going, is part of a feeling that it is not being gathered together to make an experience like Hamnet. It's not being gathered together to make an experience like the Stumping Grounds. It's not being gathered together to make something geopadic. So then it cannot direct care. It can't direct your care, which would direct your thought or make you care to continue to go forth through the death of a child or something like that that would lead to Hamnet. What's the point of this? There's kind of this subconscious question that when you listen to some people speak on a YouTube or something, there's a subconscious feeling of, well, if my child was dead, this would not help me pull through. You know, if life came at me with the real, this would not actually help me pull through. Whereas when you watch something like Hamnet, or you're in the philosophical discussions that pull you toward the beautiful, there is this intuition that actually, yes, if my child were to die or I were to encounter the real, that this would actually contribute to my pulling through. Because actually, in seeing this, I could see where the death of Shakespeare's child made this movie possible. It made that play possible. It made a horizon possible in the world that otherwise couldn't have occurred. Is that good? No. Is it beautiful? Yes. And we can live our lives. And that's why beauty should direct us, because we can't make sense of grief and death and the slings and the slings and arrows of life in this sea of trouble unless if we ask, is it good? Did I live the good life? That language will make no sense. But if you say, was it the beautiful life? Then that makes sense. Because what we end up doing is when we set, I'll throw it to Mr. Jochen here, when we set ourselves up to live the good and do the good, we create a kind of psychological tension between the realities of the absurdities and difficulties of life that we then can't square within our conception of the good and the meaning of life. We get confused and we can't make sense of it. But when we say, well, life is about making a place of art that affords a strike of beauty, then I will carry on in those slings of arrows. You know, then I will carry on and not answer, not to be, when asked that great question when standing looking over the waters. But let me throw it to Mr. Jochen. Mr. Jochen.
I wish Luber was on the call. Just before the net, we were talking about this exact idea, because Luber is asking the question, well, wait a minute, if you thematize your life, so like that's basically like, you know, kind of like you and Michelle doing like philosophize your life. Luber's kind of going down the thematize your life angle. It's going that direction, but he's reading Nicomachean Ethics with Poetics again. He's reading it again. And he's asking the question, well, wait a minute. If one thematizes your life and it's a tragedy, can you have happiness, eudaimonia? And the answer is no, you can't. You can't. Aristotle is very clear about that, because, and there's lots of variables about it. But what's important about, but here's a caveat in Aristotle's account on this point. Eudaimonia might be cut off, but blessedness is not cut off. It's beyond logos. So, and the good. So in this sense, what I mean by that is there's a line from Aristotle that says, it's related to fortune. So if you have misfortune, so a tragedy, right? Can you be happy? The answer is no. But Aristotle makes a caveat in the Ethics about it. He says, yet nevertheless, with a man of greatness of soul, their glory shines forth, even under great misfortune. And etc. He goes on. So he's acknowledging that even as happiness, eudaimonia, spiritedness in the human person has a notion of tragic contingency to it, where it can be stripped away and you can be destroyed of all your happiness. Yet, by that acknowledgement right there, the greatness of soul, especially in that context, got used by Aquinas, right, to point out that, wait a minute, there's something called blessedness, the thing that goes beyond it, so that even as you are in complete misfortune, you can still be blessed, which is an extreme move. Like, that's the point. It's beyond logos. That's the whole point. It's beyond accounts. How could you justify this under reason? You can't, because that's the reason why Aristotle doesn't talk about it very much is because the ethics is about the question, what can reason give us? Yeah, that's what the whole discussion is about. Well, how can logos the right ordered logos, all those logos with the right desire be paired together to give you virtue with eudaimonia. That's what the project's about. But yet in Aristotle, there's a discussion, it's already clear, what is the purpose of this virtue for? The one that is of those logos and the right desire. It's for the sake of the beautiful. So he already gave you that note. And by this very note about the greatness of soul shining forth despite misfortune, and other notes about the basically hyper virtue, basically of the divine. I mean, he has notes in that, and other notes about the blessed too. He has the concept of the blessedness does exist in Greek, which I think the New Testament takes on in its Greek from that point on. Okay, but so thus from those constellations you can point out, yeah, it's incomprehensible. How could you possibly talk about the death of your child as a good? And the only answer is it's by beauty saves it. Beauty saves the tragic by allowing it to be a transformational sublation of the despair into beauty. That's what beauty does. Beauty saves. This is why beauty cannot be violent. This is one of the reasons why. It's because it actually takes violence, destruction, despair, and transforms it. It takes it and works with it and spins it out and aspirates it into a whole new dimension of reality that's possible. This is our relationship to beauty, when we do it for the sake of the beautiful. But of course, if you don't have this relationship to beauty, and you get captured into all those logos, all those. I keep yelling about all those logos because it's because Javier got me pointed it out to me, and I think it's absolutely true. We're just obsessed by all those logos of the law. We just the right logos for the law. You conform to the law, you will be good. But the problem is what happens when life shuts you down from denies you that. What happens when life, reality will deny you that. You're trapped. If that's all you have in the good, that's all you got. You're done. You have nothing else. You have despair, nihilistic despair. But if you're blessed, you can actually encounter those moments and say, both either by works of creativity, by memory, imagination. Actually, I want to point out what the statement of my father is a great example of that. It really is. Because it's an activity of memory and the imagination where I get to consider, I thematize it into another orientation. Could easily be going, but my father's not here. But my father's not here. But my father, as you said, Daniel, that's absolutely, it's true. The danger is it's true. That's the catch. It is true. So thus, but why am I choosing not to go down that gutter? Why am I not going down that trajectory? Because it's not beautiful. There's more. It's not good enough. So first of all, it's true. It's not even good enough. But even the good is not good enough because of that reality being true. So thus, you got to go to the next one. Beautiful. That's all you got. I just think about that. Because, and I think the language, I think very much, obviously we have a misunderstanding what happiness is in general, but even with the Aristotelian Greek understanding of happiness, eudaimonia, which by the way, is well-spiritedness, which is attached to virtue and memory, right, and all those other points. So actually I could make an argument even within that discussion. It's oriented the right way, the blessed are happy. And this is a typical scholastic theology right here. The blessed are happy because even in the greatest misfortune, they're blessed because they are relating to their lack in a way that the non-saint can't do. We're all called to be saints. The reason why they're saints because they're at the girdle point. They have a relationship to lack. That's not nothing. And that gives a dispositional orientation to beauty. They do it for the sake of the beautiful.
Very well said. A few points, and then I'll run this fine evening. I've enjoyed it immensely. Basically, libidinal needs to pull us into the Hamnet per se, and to creating that kind of experience. When the libidinal does not do that, then it is not procreative. It is ultimately masturbatory. Because basically the thing that, especially in this moment of history, the thing that is needing to be birthed is that of which are testaments to the beautiful, precisely because we're captured in vectors of the good. So the libidinal will ultimately just prove auto-cannibalistic if it is not ultimately sublated in a life that is like Hamnet, or a life that is like these places that you enter into, these koras, spaces within a space that open up a new horizon. And the libidinal is also precisely with the eros, to overlap it with Dante, it is precisely that within us that drives us to do that. that also gives us the ability to recognize that kind of space. I would argue without Eros and Libidinal, you couldn't have that experience of the movie Hamnet. Like in that movie, the Hamnet would not be made. It would not exist. And we would be in a world of, I suppose, just the good, and the good would be eating, sleeping, and survival. That would be the good, right? And that would be animal and base in that sense, even though that, of course, has a role. But the libidinal affords the possibility of the creation of these kind of spaces, of which we cannot make. Mr. Jockin.
One note about that. So Aristotle makes a comment in Dianima that touch is of necessity the sense for existence. Existence and touch are is the relationship, bare necessity. But all the other senses are for the sake of well-being, for the sake of virtue. So I give a note about that.
Oh, and that's what great art does. It's sound, the music plays at the right time, the imagery and the visuals strike you in the right way. It is presented in the right fashion. I think what you have in a great artistic piece, great artistic pieces are not one-dimensional. The writer or the author or whoever, they think about all of it. Like great novels are going to describe sound, not just visual. Like I could go on. And it is all necessarily coordinated together in such a manner that can direct you toward the well-being. And we don't have well-being unless we have the beautiful, because otherwise well-being has to be based on the good, which is happiness, which is repression. Like you have to deny tragedy, you have to avoid tragedy, you have to avoid bad things, right? Like beauty and blessedness is the only way where you don't have repression, because you're actually able to encounter the death, you're able to encounter the horror, right? So without beauty, repression is inevitable. And the definition of happiness is a successful repression. And this, of course, is not a fully developed person. And you're going to avoid otherness, because all otherness is a threat to repression. So that, I think, yeah. And what ends up happening, too, is beauty is not sensible. It is not rational, because it's true that your father's dead. It's true that your son's dead, right? There's all that problem. And also, without beauty, you can't make sense of the problem of grief. Because if it's true they're dead, then you ought to grieve. It's true that you should grieve, right? There's no sense that grief can actually be directed toward the beautiful, where in beauty you don't deny the grief, but you see it as making possible the overall artistic experience of your life. That can be the movie Hamnet. That can actually be the blessedness of which we find fitting, and that other people can participate in and become blessed themselves. Mr. Jockin.
Becomes an activity of drive, not desire.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right. And in blessing, because I think also what you're saying about happiness is, if I were to say, is the saint happy? You know, what does this mean? Like they would say yes and no, right? Like it depends on what you mean by that, right? It would mean like the saint is going through martyrdom, they're being rejected. But in that very rejected, there's some opening up. But this gets at the Plato idea, because what the saint sees is they see reality opening up. They see the form. They see the opening. They're witnessing how the way they live opens up a horizon that can now be lived and experienced. And the witnessing of that opening up of that horizon, it's that silence after the movie. Like is that silence after the movie happiness? It's that witnessing of an ontological opening. And the saint gets to see that. And is that happiness? That's being. That's it all. That is it. And so the issue is that blessedness is a term that must be a place you walk into. It can't be a description. The problem is happiness is a description. Blessedness is a witnessing of an opening of reality. That then after you see, it's possible for reality to open that way. And therefore it is possible for you to live in such a way that your very life is a work of art that is reality opening in that way. And that's beauty and that's blessedness. And that possibility, there is no event that can happen in reality that cannot be worked into a work of art. Anything that happens in reality can be worked into creating a space like Hamnet. It can be worked into making something like that possible. Thus, there is always hope. And knowing of that very possibility then can actually be the motivation to continue on with the work. Because how did Shakespeare keep going, right? The movie is so much about that. Like, how do you continue that very motivation, right? Because you have a sense of the kind of space that can be opened. And I suppose the last thing I'll say is that I think another characteristic of, when you listen, like was mentioned earlier, of people who have bigger platforms, I think there's a feeling of they're following the law. That I'm saying everything that my audience wants to say, I'm audience captured, so I'm good. because I said nothing that would upset the Daily Wire people or something, right? And that's where it feels dead, because you're like, oh, they're following the law and therefore doing what is good. Great art can't follow the law. Does Hamnet follow the freaking law? What does that mean? Hamnet doesn't follow the law. Your kid's not supposed to die. This is not supposed to happen. The law is not followed, and yet a space can be created that afterwards you have that silence. So art exists outside the law. It exists precisely in that willingness to rise to the occasion of seeing the law fail, to seeing your plan fail, to seeing your expectations fail. Everything failed. It all failed. And the blessed is the one who stands in that failure and precisely watches reality open because of that failure to afford a new horizon of beauty that can be known no other way. And that's what the artist is doing. The virtuous does what the artist does, and the art overcomes the subject-object divide in the sense that the art work shows what the subject can be in virtue if they do the work of discerning how to in fact be in that virtue, to let the space, let the spirit flow, and not try to calculate its end, but actually contribute to the stewarding of those kind of experiences that people can into and taste the spirit, right? So art as an experience, like the movie Hamnet, becomes something that points to a kind of experience that is possible. And the question that is left hanging, okay, we know this can be done in a movie. Can it be done in a life? And that's what philosophy is trying to figure out. And that's what we're trying to do. And the answer changes based on the year, based on the country, based on the person, based on the situation. So it changes based on the type of story and the time phase. It changes for the movie. It changes for the content of the movie, right? But we know it's possible because you've experienced it. And if it's possible and it can be experienced, it's worth thinking about if we can do it with our very lives. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here this evening. I've appreciated immensely. All the best to you.